Hey guys, tonight we delve into the abandoned salt cathedral caverns of Wieliczka, a place where the earth's whispering breath greets you at every turn and centuries of human toil linger in every grain. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. While you're at it, drop a comment below letting me know which city you're tuning in from and what time it is there right now, so we can feel connected across time zones. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. A cool draft rolls out from the cavern's mouth, carrying the faint tang of salt and an almost imperceptible hum that seems to pulse through your chest. Stepping into the yawning salt mouth, the world above slips away, replaced by shadowed walls the color of pale moonlight. Medieval miners first breached this subterranean realm in the 13th century, following veins of crystallized sodium chloride, so pure they called it white gold. Poland's monarchs quickly realized the treasure beneath their feet. Salt tax revenues, known as the zoom, would underwrite armies, fortresses, and courtly extravagances alike. Steely torchlight fractures against polished salt, sending flickers dancing across vaulted ceilings carved by hands long gone. Carving tools, once simple iron picks and wooden mallets, left marks that still speak of rhythm and ritual. Historians are still debating whether those early expansions were driven by royal decree or the autonomy of local mining guilds, each arguing that their preferred narrative best honors the toil and ingenuity required to tame this underground frontier. Glimmers of crystallized stalactites hang overhead like suspended icicles. Yet no frost chills your spine. Underground temperatures remain a steady 14 degrees Celsius 57 degrees Fahrenheit, day in and day out. That stability made these caverns ideal not only for salt extraction but also for curing meat and storing wine, as chronicled in trade records from the late Middle Ages. Winds channeled through purpose-built shafts carried away dust and precisely controlled humidity, though scholars still dispute just how sophisticated those 14th-century engineers truly were. At the threshold of the first working level, rope and wood scaffolds creak under your weight. Narrow tunnels fan out like a spider's web, each corridor driven by miners eager to extend their claim on the luminous salt veins. One peculiar tradition persisted here. Rough-hewn benches carved from blocks of pure salt provided resting spots for exhausted laborers. Medieval health manuals even recommended licking those benches to stave off cramps. A therapy that sounds more like legend than medicine, yet accounts survive in local monastic records. Below the main access shaft, brine springs bubble up from unseen depths, pooling in shallow basins that glint like liquid glass. These mineral-rich waters were once channeled via wooden troughs to surface breweries, where monks distilled a potent ale infused with saline tang, an obscure drink so prized that nobles paid handsomely for barrels of this underground brew. Shadowed corners reveal inscriptions, names, dates, crude crosses, evidence of individual lives etched into salt-flecked walls. It's said that one miner even sculpted his own likeness in a small alcove, only for the figure to vanish overnight, swallowed by shifting brine. Folklore claims this is the work of the Salt Wraith, a specter born from too many nights spent underground. Twisting deeper into the heart of the mine, the tunnels narrow until the air grows still. Light bends through thick salt crystals, fracturing into rainbow shards that dot the walls like cosmic graffiti. Orientation slips easily here, and even veteran guides carry knotted cords to mark their path, an old-school solution in the age before numbered signposts. Distant drips echo through the gloom, each plip resonating against silent pillars of salt until it collides with the floor in a soft plunk. Every drop carves away at the rock, a reminder that these caverns remain alive, still reshaped by water's patient hand. Geological surveys confirm that Wieliczka's labyrinth extends over 300 kilometers, though most chambers beyond the 9th level remain off-limits. Faint outlines of collapsed passages loom in the distance, where centuries-old tremors caused ceilings to cave in, sealing off entire wings of the mine. Local lore speaks of an epic quake so fierce that a hidden chapel, once dedicated to Saint Kinga, crumpled in an instant. While archaeological teams uncovered remnants of that chapel in the 19th century, nobody can say exactly when or why the collapse occurred, and some scholars question if it ever happened at all. Feeble lantern light reveals tools abandoned mid-shift, rusted picks, wooden buckets, lantern frames. A miner's diary, its leather cover stiff with mineral residue, lies wedged between rocks. Pages faded. It recounts a day when boredom drove men to carve chess pieces from salt, a pastime that reportedly spread through the ranks until entire sets lay scattered in side tunnels. Echoes begin to sound like whispers. The faint murmur of prayer once offered to Saint Kinga, patroness of salt miners, whose legend says she threw her engagement ring into a Polish salt spring, creating the first brine lake at Wieliczka. Wider chambers host crude altars, now weathered to ghostly monuments. Academic debate rages over whether these were formal chapels endorsed by the church or improvised shrines born of miners' personal devotions. Gravity shifts subtly as the floor slopes downward, propelling you deeper and compelling every step to feel like slipping into another realm. Ratcheted ladders, some spanning dozens of meters, rattle underfoot, each rung carved by those who risked their lives for a chunk of crystallized earth. Rust and salt encrust every surface. Yet even here, pockets of life survive. Tiny crustaceans cling to brine pools, their pale shells transparent against the dark. Scientists once believed these critters were exclusive to other salt mines, but recent samples confirm a unique subspecies thrives only here. A discovery that rewrote part of Wieliczka's natural history. Faces burn with reverence and fear as you approach the edge of the first major chamber, where the ceiling soars overhead like a broken cathedral. Columns of salt rise from the floor, moving deeper into the labyrinth. Torchlight ripples across walls of pale halite, turning each crystal face into a living canvas of dancing shadows and gleaming facets. The corridor tightens, pressure humming in your chest as polished salt surfaces draw nearer. Narrow grooves carved into the walls once held small wooden pegs for hanging lanterns, and even now the iron nail heads glint in the beam's glow. Centuries ago, miners approached these passages with a mixture of reverence and dread, aware that every stroke of their pick edged them farther from daylight and deeper into the earth's silent heart. Mirrored surfaces catch every flicker, casting thousands of tiny reflections that race along the ceiling like flickering fireflies. Microscopic ridges and microstrata in the salt break light into prismatic slivers, painting the walls with subtle rainbows that vanish almost as quickly as they appear. Within each shimmering patch, the faintest impression of a thumbprint still lingers, a tactile reminder of the hand that once smoothed these walls, polishing by methodical abrasion until the salt shone like glass beneath torchlight. A specialized polishing technique emerged in the 16th century to reduce hazardous dust stirred by blasting and chiseling. Hard salt blocks, shaped into rudimentary sanding stones, were rubbed against freshly hewn walls in long, deliberate strokes. Local guild records note that this process took several weeks for each corridor, but the reward was a walkway so bright that a single lamp could illuminate nearly 50 meters ahead. Historians are still debating whether these master polishers operated under royal decree or as autonomous artisans paid by mining cooperatives to showcase their craft in tunnels meant to impress visiting dignitaries. Animal fat mixed with crushed salt crystals provided a crude but effective polishing paste, a detail preserved in a single 17th-century ledger discovered in Krakow's municipal archives. Rubbing this mixture into the walls filled microscopic pits and smoothed irregularities until the salt gleamed. An unexpected side effect was a faint sheen of iridescence when humidity fluctuated, producing ghost frost patterns along the upper reaches of the walls. Few sources mention this curious phenomenon, yet generations of miners swore the walls appeared to whisper names when moonlight above triggered the right temperature shift. Dripping water creates its own hidden spectacle as brine droplets cascade from stalactites formed by centuries of seepage. Each plip resonates against the smooth salt like a chime, producing the so-called singing walls, effect that travelers first noted in the early 1800s. Some claim that the rhythmic echoes align with the mine's natural acoustic frequencies, creating half-heard melodies that lure the unwary deeper into the darkness. Geologists have measured the sound patterns, and while the mechanics are documented, the exact reasons these corridors amplify specific tones remain elusive. Humidity hovers around 60 to 70%, creating a microclimate that preserves the salt's gleam but also nurtures microscopic halophilic bacteria. These hardy organisms feed on trace minerals, forming biofilms that sometimes darken patches of wall in subtle models. Scientific surveys in the 1970s cataloged dozens of such species, but the full extent of the underground microbiome here is still being mapped. Many of these salt-loving microbes yield enzymes with potential industrial applications, a modern boon hidden within medieval caverns. Embedded fossils from the Permian period occasionally surface within the salt walls, slender imprints of prehistoric marine creatures trapped in evaporite layers over 240 million years ago. An obscure 19th century pamphlet describes a fossilized nautiloid chamber discovered near this very corridor, complete with spiral whorls filled with crystalline salt. Paleontologists only recently confirmed that some of these fossil inclusions are unique to the Wieliczka deposit, providing rare windows into ancient ecosystems long before human footsteps echoed beneath these vaulted ceilings. Inscriptions carved between mineral seams reveal miners' names, dates of work shifts, and even short prayers. One slab bears a crude cross alongside the phrase Sanct Kinga, Ora pro nobis, scratched into the salt by a solitary worker in 1632. That particular inscription endured for centuries until later repolishing nearly erased it, leaving only a faint whisper of letters. Such graffiti is both historical record and emotional testament, offering glimpses of faith and identity preserved in salt rather than ink. Corridor intersections served as way stations marked by simple notches and arrows, an underground signage system predating modern numbering. Miners, guides, and later explorers used these hand-chiseled symbols to navigate the maze, an ingenious solution born of necessity. While above-ground roads boasted milestones and direction stones, beneath the earth-carved shafts pointed the way, an elegant parallel that underscores human ingenuity in any setting. Scholars continue to debate whether these reflective corridors functioned solely for practical lighting or also held ritual significance. Some argue that the polished walls formed part of a pilgrimage route, guiding the faithful toward chapels deeper within the mine. Others contend they were purely utilitarian, designed to minimize the number of oil lamps needed and reduce fire hazard. Historians are still debating this question, drawing upon fragmentary guild records and scant monastic correspondence for clues. Nighttime explorations in the 18th century transformed these corridors into impromptu concert halls, with polished walls amplifying the strains of fiddles and pipes. Visitors huddled against the salt, wallets in hand, paying pence to hear miners perform folk tunes. These early entertainments are barely documented, surviving only in travelers' letters that mention music echoing through mirrored halls. It's the kind of quirky legacy that feels more like legend than fact. Yet enough written notes persist to assert that it really happened. Silence returns once the last echoes fade, and the corridors stand empty but alive, pulsing with the memory of light and sound. Every polished plane reflects the slow passage of time, capturing the fleeting glow of each torch and the subtle motion of every passing figure. In this silent gallery, salt becomes soft echoes of hammer against salt linger in the narrow tunnel before settling into silence. Torches flare against carved reliefs lining the corridor walls, where saints, miners, and mythical beasts emerge from pale halite as if summoned by ancient hands. Every chisel mark glints under your lamp's glow, each strike a testament to its century-old dialogue between human craft and crystalline stone. In these depths, artistry and industry merge, medieval artisans refusing to accept salt merely as a commodity, transforming it into narrative, devotion, and sometimes even mischief. Initial workshops sat just beyond the primary haulage shafts, where timber scaffolding creaked under the weight of ambition. Apprentices in threadbare tunics worked beside master carvers whose leather aprons bore patched seams and streaks of salt residue. These artisans wielded tools as simple as pointed iron picks, polished bronze chisels, and wooden mallets wrapped in cloth. Guild regulations, first codified in the late 14th century under King Casimir III, dictated that every relief must pass inspection by a master before the next layer of excavation could proceed. Failure to meet standards resulted in fines paid in additional cartloads of salt, a harsh penalty that ensured both quality and productivity. Scenes carved into the walls ranged from pious to playful. One chapel's entrance features a bas-relief of Saint Kinga presenting her ring to a shimmering brine lake, her flowing robes rendered with such depth that folds seem to ripple under torchlight. Further along, Miners HEW salt blocks with picks and gather at an improvised feast, flagons raised in celebration. A rare glimpse into camaraderie underground. A slender frieze illustrates a procession of villagers carrying baskets of salted fish, their faces carved with enough realism to suggest individual identities. Such narrative reliefs served dual purposes. They honored the saints while documenting local customs for illiterate workers. Guild archives in Krakow describe the commissioning process in meticulous detail. Wealthy patrons, ranging from monastic orders to city magistrates, could request specific iconography, often paying twice the going rate per cubic meter of carved stone. Payments took the form of salted meat, fine cloth, and even livestock delivered to village markets. One record from 1423 notes that the Carthusian monks of Jasna Gora supplied 12 sheep and 6 barrels of ale to secure a depiction of the Virgin Mary flanked by angels made entirely of salt. That chapter of the mine's economic history illustrates the unusual barter economy that flourished beneath the earth. Intricate tools appear in some reliefs themselves, carved with such precision that modern archaeologists once mistook them for contemporary reconstructions. A 15th-century depiction of an adjustable wooden scaffold, complete with ratchet-like gear teeth, led to heated debates about medieval engineering prowess. Historians are still debating this question, whether these images reflect accurate workshop technology or were symbolic representations meant to convey divine order. Surviving fragments of actual scaffolding, recovered during 19th-century excavations, confirm the existence of wheel-driven winches, though whether they functioned as depicted remains unclear. An obscure but delightful detail appears in the so-called miner's gallery, where reliefs portray whimsical faces peering from salt alcoves. Local folklore credits these salt gremlins with playful mischief, hiding tools, rattling helmet chains, even rearranging carved chess pieces left behind by bored artisans. A solitary 16th-century manuscript, found tucked into a salt-encrusted bucket, warns novices to leave offerings of breadcrumbs to keep the gremlins satisfied. Whether real or imagined, such beliefs shaped workshop culture, providing a psychological balm against the darkness and danger of underground labor. Bright hues once coated many carvings. Traces of red ochre, lapis lazuli, and even powdered malachite hint at vibrant polychrome programs intended to mimic above-ground churches. Though salt's hygroscopic nature proved destructive to painted surfaces, microscopic pigment granules cling stubbornly to fissures, teasing historians with glimpses of chromatic splendor. An experimental restoration in the 1950s applied consolidants that revealed faint floral patterns on archways, a discovery that sparked controversy over the ethics of intervening in subterranean heritage. Some conservators argue that any modern treatment risks accelerating salt decay, while others insist careful consolidation is vital to preserve what remains. Scattered fragments of wooden scaffolds carry inscriptions in faded ink, names followed by tally marks indicating days worked, and occasionally brief prayers. One carpenter, identified as Jakub the Younger, etched the Latin phrase protege nos in dibus nostris, protect us in our days, before the wood became dust. Documentary evidence shows that carpenters and carvers often shared space, but maintained separate quarters to prevent accidents. Wooden chips and salt dust formed treacherous combinations beneath foot. Their uneasy coexistence underscores the cooperative yet hierarchical nature of medieval mine workshops. Chiseling salt demanded finesse and an intimate understanding of the mineral's grain. Too heavy a blow could shatter an entire panel. Too light, and the tool would skid, marring the surface. Master carvers developed a specialized technique known as dry tapping, where the chisel was tapped at a low angle to produce fine, controlled flakes. Apprentices practiced on sacrificial blocks, often carving geometric patterns until their hands bled, a rite of passage chronicled in monastic disciplinary records. This painful training regimen produced artisans capable of coaxing both robustness and delicate beauty from the unforgiving salt. Imagery of beasts also occupied artisans' imaginations. Bas-reliefs depict wyverns coiled around salt columns, their scaled flanks etched in meticulous cross-hatched lines, tongues flickering in silent menace. Scholars debate whether such mythical creatures served as moral warnings, temptation and sin lurking below the earth, or merely satisfied a taste for fantasy among miners longing for familiar tales from above. Folklore suggests that these carvings were painted with phosphorescent compounds, possibly crushed bioluminescent fungi, to glow faintly in the dark, a claim once dismissed as legend until 21st century chemical analyses detected trace luminol residues. In niches carved for devotional objects, salt tablets bore simple crosses or stylized rosettes, intended as offerings by individual miners seeking divine favor before each shift. One particularly well-preserved tablet features a sundial motif, complete with hour markings that align at a specific point when torchlight from the entrance catches it just right. Some interpret this as evidence that artisans measured time underground with surprising accuracy, while others see it as an allegory of mortality and the fleeting nature of life, all carved in gleaming salt. Occasional graffiti bursts from the solemnity of religious art. A crudely etched donkey sporting a miner's helmet, or a fish with human-like eyes clutching a pick in its fin. Such light-hearted jabs reveal artisans' humor and perhaps their desire to mock authority in subtle ways. These playful carvings sometimes appear near official guild reliefs, suggesting a tolerant oversight that allowed moments of irreverence, an underground safety valve amidst rigid hierarchies. Whether sanctioned by masters or scribed in secret, this folk art underscores the humanity behind the salt. Complex theological scenes mingle with everyday subjects. One alcove shows the Annunciation framed by a stylized mine shaft, angels rendered with pickaxes slung over their shoulders. This blending of sacred and profane iconography illustrates how miners perceive their work, not as mere labor but as a holy endeavor, mining God's creation with reverence. Medieval sermons preached in neighboring parishes emphasized salt's symbolism as purity and preservation, reinforcing the notion that these subterranean artisans were partners in a divine mission. Late Gothic influences ripple through the carvings, evident in elongated figures and intricate drapery. Yet regional variations persist. Silesian motifs appear alongside motifs drawn from Venetian workshops, a testament to cross-cultural exchange via trade networks that delivered luxury goods and artistic inspiration into Poland's interior. Some historians argue that Italian master sculptors were brought in to train local artisans, though documentary proof remains scant. Guild charters reference foreign masters, but use vague terminology, leaving room for debate over whether these were fully trained journeymen or simply experienced miners from other districts. Small votive tablets tucked into wall crevices display delicate peasant scenes. A couple dancing, harvest toil, and even a dog chasing a rabbit. These panels, often hidden from immediate view, were likely personal offerings rather than public commissions. A single ledger mentions hidden works, created by night shift carvers seeking spiritual solace, or hoping to impress a loved one above ground. That entry stands as the only direct reference to these secret carvings, suggesting their creators prized anonymity above acclaim. Remnants of armor and helmets fashioned from salt have puzzled antiquarians since the mine's rediscovery in the 19th century. Though too fragile for a rumble of distant footsteps and the clink of metal herald another shift in the salt mine. You muster resolve as the heavy wooden doors swing open, admitting a rush of cool, briny air. Lanterns bob along the timber walkway, their flickering glow drawing long shadows against sculpted walls. The ritual begins. An exchange of nods with fellow miners, each shouldering a heavy pick or shouldering wooden buckets that will soon be filled with crystalline, seems torn from the earth. Narrow tracks guide laden carts into the first chamber, where vaulted ceilings arch overhead like the ribs of a great subterranean beast. Rope and pulley systems creak under tension as you descend further, each rung of the ladder carved into salt-coated beams. Historical records from the 14th century tell of teams of 12 men to a shift, rotating every 8 hours to maximize output without sacrificing safety. Salt formed the backbone of Poland's medieval economy, its crown revenues underwritten by taxes on every block extracted, and miners felt that weight every moment they chipped away at the walls. Simple tools remain constant companions. An iron pick with a pickaxe head polished smooth by centuries of use, a wooden mallet ringed with braided leather, and stout boots layered with salted wool to guard against cuts. Polished bronze chisels, passed down through generations, catch the lantern light as you test its edge on fresh salt. Apprentices practice on sacrificial blocks, repeating the same angle hundreds of times until they know the grain's every quirk. A specialized technique called dry tapping produces controlled flakes rather than shards, ensuring that prized sculpting areas remain intact for later decorative work. Ventilation shafts carved at precise intervals draw up stale air while funneling fresh breezes down to the working galleries. Ingenious miners crafted ceramic anemometers, small bowls with perforated rims, that measured airflow by the speed of spinning vanes. This obscure gadget, documented in a single 15th century treatise, ultimately gave way to larger chimney stacks encrusted with salt, their height calibrated by trial and error. Humidity hovered between 60 and 70%, a balance that preserved salt integrity but also fostered salt dust that stung the lungs when blown into a miner's face. Rations arrive in wicker baskets. Dense rye bread, salted pork rind, and sun-dried plums stored in brine-soaked cloth. A traveler's guide from Krakow notes miners dipping stale crusts into brine to soften them, a practice frowned upon above ground for defacing good bread, yet essential for sustaining energy during 12-hour shifts. A flask of mead infused with iodine-rich herbs serves as both a warming tonic and a crude antiseptic for minor cuts. Few sources mention that on winter nights, miners roasted wild mushrooms over oil lamps, claiming the smoky aroma kept cave spiders at bay. Hands slick with brine, you pause to rub salt crystals from under your fingernails and press a handful to your lips. The mineral-rich tang steadies a queasy stomach and wards off cramps, a daily ritual passed down through local lore. Chroniclers of the era linked this practice to lower rates of goiter among miners, a mainstream health observation that transformed public perception of salt from mere seasoning to life-sustaining necessity. Still, scholars debate whether improved nutrition or constant inhalation of salt aerosols played the larger role in miners' relative well-being. Echoes of laughter and clinking mugs drift from a makeshift tavern carved into a side alcove. Miners gamble with bone dice carved from leftover salt chunks, placing bets on the speed of water droplets falling from stalactites. Leather cards dyed with beet juice serve as playing cards, though records remain inconclusive on whether these games were sanctioned or strictly illicit. Historians are still debating whether these underground taverns were officially regulated by mining authorities or operated entirely at miners' discretion, unrecorded by the guild ledgers that dominate the written record. Small crosses and crude altars appear at periodic junctions, offerings of twisted barley stalks or bits of cloth pinned to salt tablets. A silent ritual unfolds before each descent, touching these symbols while whispering a prayer to Saint Kinga, patroness of salt miners, whose legend promised protection against cave-ins. Minuscule salt votives shaped like animals, sheep, deer, even hounds, lie abandoned, tokens left to appease unseen spirits. One obscure text offers guidelines for crafting these tiny sculptures, its provenance traced only to a single library shelf discovered in the 18th century. Darkness brings danger. Sudden rumbles signal shifting ceilings, and brine floods can surge without warning from unseen springs. Miners test the air with smoky sheaves of hay, watching for plumes of black damp, the notorious methane that poisoned work crews. A handful of pepper saved from a nobleman's feast served as a makeshift detector, believed to deepen its aroma in low-oxygen conditions. Modern researchers attribute this to volatile compounds in brine, but the miners themselves trusted the folk method, attributing their senses to God's gift of smell. Fatigue settles into every muscle as the shift winds down. Carts slide down channel tracks, depositing their loads at the hoisting point. Each sack of salt weighs more than a man's lantern and tools combined, testament to the strength demanded in these subterranean arenas. Before climbing back to the surface, a final tradition endures, licking a small wafer of pure salt left on a wooden post. Some claim this wards off ill fortune above ground. Others insist it seals the bargains made with underground spirits, though monastic scribes dismissed such practices as superstitious nonsense. Ascending the ladder, salted dust falls like fine rain, settling in boots and beard. Daylight outside floods the mind's mouth, a sudden brightness that steals your breath. Reflection fills you as the cool morning air dries sweat on temple and brow. Fellow miners murmur relief at the shift's end, exchanging half-smiles and salt-stained handshakes before scattering to homes, taverns, or chapels above. The cycle resets 12 hours later, a relentless loop bound by the rhythm of extraction and the unending appetite of kingdoms reliant on salt's power. Some nights, back in a cramped chamber above, you recount the day's trials to a bystander's ear. Stories of hairline cracks discovered, torchlight glimmers against walls sculpted into flowing drapery and soaring arches as the corridor widens into a sacred grotto. Salt pillars rise like marble columns, their bases carved into intricate floral patterns that guide the eye upward toward a vaulted ceiling shimmering with crystalline stalactites. A hush settles over the space, broken only by the soft drip of brine from unseen fissures high above. Miners centuries ago transformed this hidden chamber into a chapel dedicated to Saint Kinga, whose legendary ring is said to have created the first brine springs. Every surface bears the imprint of devotion and artistry, turning raw mineral into a place of worship deep beneath the earth. Legend holds that Kinga, a 13th-century Polish princess, threw her betrothal ring into a Hungarian salt spring on the eve of her marriage. Miraculously, a new spring erupted at Wieliczka, marking the first discovery of the mine's veins. This tale became the heart of the chapel's iconography. Reliefs along the nave depict Kinga kneeling by a pool, ring gleaming, as miners raise their picks in reverent salute. Mainstream historians agree that the legend, first recorded in the 16th-century Chronicle of Krakow, fueled pilgrimages and bolstered royal support for expanding the mine's depths. Yet the precise date when miners first carved a devotional space remains uncertain, with most estimates placing construction around the late 1600s under the patronage of Bishop Andrzej Trzebicki. Hidden in a narrow side alcove lies an obscure baptismal font hewn entirely from pink-tinted salt. Its basin still holds brine, preserved by the chapel's stable microclimate. Parish records from a nearby village mention clandestine baptisms performed by friars who slipped through secret passages, using the font's waters to welcome newborns into the faith. Few scholars have studied this font in depth, making its liturgical use one of the mine's most intriguing mysteries. The mere existence of a baptismal feature so far underground suggests a blending of miner superstition and ecclesiastical ritual few other sites can claim. Polished pews carved from solid salt blocks flank the central aisle, their smooth surfaces worn by centuries of kneeling worshippers. Each bench bears carved prayer inscriptions in medieval Latin, most common being Ora pro nobis, Sancta Kinga, Pray for us, Saint Kinga. These phrases recur with subtle variations, reflecting personal petitions. One reads Voda Vultus pro Famulis, a vow of health for the workers. Obscure references to individual miners appear alongside communal supplications, hinting at private devotions whispered in the dim glow of lanterns. Archaeologists catalogued over 30 unique inscriptions during 19th-century restorations, but dozens more likely remain hidden in remote niches. Lantern holders shaped like salt-crafted cherubs line the nave, their expressions frozen between joy and solemnity. Each holds a shallow bowl designed to cradle oil lamps. Miner-written journals describe these as custodians of light, guiding the faithful toward the altar. A single 17th-century diary entry notes that one cherub's lamp holder once cracked and drenched a visiting priest in brine, inspiring a bawdy ditty among the miners that survives in oral tradition. Such bracing humor helped sustain camaraderie in a place where faith and labor intertwined. Suspended from the ceiling, chandeliers carved from salt clusters drip tiny crystals like chandelier tears. Modern analyses suggest the original artisans understood the chapel's acoustics well. The chandelier's shape scatters sound, creating a gentle reverberation that turns whispered prayers into low, humming echoes. Historians are still debating this question, whether the design was intentional or simply a byproduct of available rock formations. Acoustic measurements in recent decades reveal that the chapel enhances frequencies around 300 to 500 Hz, the human voice's most resonant range, lending singers' voices an almost ethereal quality. Walls behind the altar display a grand relief of Saint Kinga's legend rendered in dramatic bas-relief. Figures tower nearly 3 meters high, their proportions guided by Renaissance ideals that emphasize humanism and divine grace. The angel who presents Kinga with her future crown holds a salt-carved scroll inscribed with archaic Polish, a rare vernacular inclusion. Linguists debate whether this integration indicates miners' literacy in both Latin and Old Polish or reflects influence from local parish clergy. Historians remain divided on whether the text was added later or carved alongside the main relief. A narrow spiral staircase of salt-worn steps descends behind the altar to a hidden crypt. Here, relics of early miners, wooden tools, leather pouches, and fragments of rosaries lie preserved under a thin film of mineral crust. Carbon dating places some items as early as the 15th century, suggesting that devotion to Saint Kinga began informally long before the chapel's formal construction. These relics occupy a low-ceiling cavity where only a crouching figure can pass, making access a secret rite reserved for the chapel's guardians. Local folklore claims only elected salt wardens could enter this crypt, enforcing a silent covenant between labor and faith. Candles once burned in ornate salt sconces along the side walls, leaving stubborn wax stains still visible today. A rarely cited ledger from 1682 lists annual expenses: oil for lamps, beeswax for candles, and a special allotment of frankincense donated by Krakow's cathedral chapter. That document also mentions a share of donations dedicated to repairing water damage after brine floods, a reminder of the chapel's perpetual battle with its own elemental medium. Balancing preservation with use has challenged caretakers for centuries, and modern conservationists continue to debate the ethics of intervention versus natural patina. Ritual objects crafted from salt include a delicate crucifix and a series of rosary beads, each bead a perfectly spherical drop of halite. Scientific surveys in the 1970s identified microfractures in the crucifix's corpus, likely caused by fluctuating humidity when the mine's ventilation changed. Yet the crucifix remains intact, suspended in a glass case to shield it from further stress. That case, sealed in 1958, created controversy. Some feared that isolating the crucifix would deprive it of the chapel's sacred atmosphere, while others argued it was the only way to prevent irreversible damage. Scholars are still debating this question, weighing conservation against spiritual integrity. Echoes of chants once filled the chamber during feast days honoring Saint Barbara and Saint Kinga alike. Written accounts by 18th-century pilgrims describe processions of robed miners, carrying torches and chanting litanies that resonated through the caverns. While no musical notation survives, researchers reconstructed possible melodies by mapping the chapel's acoustic profile and comparing it with contemporary liturgical chants. The result: a haunting, looped drone that could have lifted voices into reverence, even as pickaxes tapped in distant galleries. Natural salt formations intertwine with carved ornamentation at every turn. Columns exhibit banding patterns in shades of pink, gray, and white, marking seasonal shifts in mineral deposition. Obscure geological studies note that each color band corresponds to variations in ancient lake salinity and biological content, captured in crystal growth over millions of years. These natural stripes provide an unintended timeline, slicing through carved iconography and reminding worshippers that God's handiwork precedes human craft. Pilgrimages to this subterranean chapel peaked in the early 19th century, when Krakow's urban elite sought novel piety experiences. Special lantern processions invited visitors to trace miner-made footpaths by lantern light, culminating in silent prayer before the salt altar. Ticket ledgers survive in the municipal archive, recording thousands of names including nobles, merchants, and even foreign dignitaries. Despite its popularity, formal church records remain scant, fueling debate over whether bishops officially endorsed these pilgrimages or merely tolerated them as local custom. Fine details emerge under close inspection. Tiny salt-carved lily motifs on the altar rail, symbolizing purity, and miniature fleur-de-lis marking the coats of arms of benefactors. One discrete carving shows a miner's helmet atop crossed hammers, a self-referential emblem never sanctioned by ecclesiastical authorities. This subtle motif appears only in low relief, perhaps to avoid clerical censure. That miners felt free to inscribe their own symbol in a holy space speaks to a negotiated tolerance between lay craft and church hierarchy. Departing the chapel, lantern light fades against the polished salt floors, leaving only the hush of measured breath and distant drips. A final glance at the altar's salt chalice, carved with vines and grape clusters, reminds that sustenance below ground mirrored sacraments above. Each drip from the chapel's hidden brine springs tastes of consecration, a mineral communion that nourished bodies and souls alike. Torch extinguished, you pause at the chapel's portal, mapping its ornate arches against memory. Ahead lies the path to brine springs that feed hidden pools and secret channels, where water's patient hand continues shaping this underground realm. A sense of brine water glimmers in the torchlight, pooling in shallow hollows carved from centuries of mineral-laden drips. Fingers of liquid salt snake along low channels in the floor, guiding you toward hidden springs that feed secret caverns deep within the mine. Medieval miners prized these brine sources above all else, for boiling the water was the primary method of extracting pure salt before mechanized pumps existed. Records from the 14th century cite royal edicts mandating protection of each known spring, their precise locations jealously guarded by mining guilds. Ancient maps, hand-drawn on parchment and smudged with salt stains, mark the first documented spring as Osana's well. Legend attributes its discovery to a novice miner who slipped on a moist ledge and felt the temperature drop as brine welled at his feet. Mainstream historians accept that miners followed telltale signs, vegetation dying above certain shafts, or a faint saline scent on the air, to locate new water sources. Yet exact techniques remain part of the mine's secret lore, passed orally from one generation to the next. A hidden channel diverts brine toward a rough-hewn settling basin, where suspended impurities sink before the clearer liquid flows onward. Hard-packed wooden troughs once guided the water into sealed boilers above ground, but here in the depths you encounter vestiges of medieval engineering. Stone sluices carved with sluice gates controlled by simple levers. An obscure treatise from 1492 describes these sluices with surprising precision, noting that adjusting a single wooden wedge could alter flow rate by up to a third. Such empirical knowledge hints at miners' early mastery of fluid dynamics, though scholars are still debating whether these designs were local innovations or adaptations of Roman hydraulic techniques. Suspended lantern light shivers off brine-soaked walls, where mineral incrustations build up into delicate filigree. At times, these salt flowers form lace-like curtains, their fragile petals dissolving at the slightest touch. Botanical analogues coined in the 19th century, halite corolla and crystalline ossifrage, capture miners' sense of wonder. Yet these terms carry little weight among geologists today. Modern surveys identify dozens of salt morphologies here, including rare black salt shoots, stained by manganese deposits. This curious discoloration generated local legends of subterranean dragons exhaling smoke through fissures, though chemical analysis confirms the pattern's purely mineral origin. Venturing close to the main spring chamber, the steady drip-drip-drip reverberates like muted rainfall. Echoes gather momentum in the vaulted space, creating a continuous background murmur that miners likened to a distant choir. Acoustic studies conducted in the 1970s show the chamber amplifies frequencies between 400 and 600 Hz, giving the drips an uncanny tonal quality. Some researchers argue this was a serendipitous byproduct of the chamber's geometry, while others contend miners intentionally shaped the walls to enhance these echoes for morale-boosting effects during long shifts. Historians are still debating this question, drawing upon both acoustic engineering models and anecdotal mining journals. Nestled in a recess off the main gallery lies the mirror pool, so called for its near-perfect reflective surface. Droplets accumulate until they coalesce into a glassy sheet that mirrors torch beams and chiseling figures alike. An obscure 17th century alchemist's manuscript claims the mirror pool's water contained magical properties, that a miner who gazed upon his reflection 3 times under a full moon would dream of new salt veins. While modern chemists dismiss these notions, noting no anomalous trace elements in water samples, the myth persists among local villagers who occasionally trek underground seeking visionary inspiration. Brine emerges from fissures in the rock face, so pure it tastes like fine table salt with a hint of metallic minerality. Sipping directly was once a rite of passage for apprentices, testing both bravery and salt tolerance. Chroniclers noted that some novices fell ill from overconsumption. Salt toxicity can induce severe dehydration when not balanced by fresh water. Yet medieval guides touted the practice as a way to build resilience. Contemporary health experts confirm that while trace amounts of minerals can be beneficial, excessive intake leads to electrolyte imbalances, a reality medieval miners would have discovered through trial and error. Tiny amphipod crustaceans dart beneath the brine's surface, their translucent bodies adapted to the hypersaline environment. Zoologists first documented these organisms in 1885, naming them Gammarus halophilus, but a recent genetic analysis suggests they constitute a distinct subspecies found only in Wieliczka. These cryptic creatures feed on microbial mats that coat submerged salt rock, forming a miniature underground ecosystem unnoticed for centuries. Miners, however, occasionally glimpse them as saltfish in lamplight, mistaking them for escaped tadpoles. A quirky anecdote recorded by a traveler in 1812. Beyond the mirror pool, a narrow fissure leads to the singing spring, its water bursting forth in a steady torrent. The sound upon entry veers from gentle drips to a low roar, surprising first-time visitors unprepared for its power. Medieval maintenance crews constructed a series of earthen dams to regulate the surge, yet all traces of that infrastructure have long since dissolved under ceaseless flow. Archaeological probes reveal remnant wooden posts and stone packing, but dating them precisely remains difficult, fueling scholarly debate over whether the dams predate or postdate major mine expansions in the 15th century. Historians continue to dispute the chronology of these hydraulic works. Patterns in salt sediment reveal seasonal cycles. Summer floods bring silt that settles in alternating dark bands, while winter's reduced flow leaves purer crystals. Geological studies correlate these layers with historical climate data, suggesting that the mine's brine springs once reflected broader environmental shifts across Central Europe. A spike in silt layers around 1315 aligns with the Great Famine, when excessive rainfall eroded farmland, an example of how surface catastrophes echoed beneath ground. Yet some researchers argue localized seismic activity better explains certain anomalies, an interpretation that remains contested among earth scientists. Walkways rim the main spring basin, scuffed by centuries of boots. Occasional calcium deposits form step terraces, small ledges where brine drips pool and cascade gently downward. These natural basins created microhabitats for halophilic bacteria, whose pigment-producing colonies stain terraces in pale pink and orange. Early microbiologists in the 1920s cataloged these hues, coining salt blossom to describe the phenomenon. While their taxonomy has since evolved, modern investigators still debate the full spectrum of extremophiles present and whether any hold untapped biotechnological potential. In a secluded nook stands a crude paddle wheel, once turned by brine flow, to power a rudimentary bellows for a surface forge. Miners carved the wheel from dense oak and coated it with a resin salt mixture to resist corrosion. Only fragmentary planks remain, encrusted with halite, yet their placement suggests sophisticated integration of hydraulic power underground. Engineering historians are divided over whether this apparatus was a one-off experimental device or part of a wider but short-lived program of subterranean mechanization. The dearth of contemporaneous records makes resolution elusive. Delving deeper, the passage slopes downward until it opens onto a sunken courtyard of salt-encrusted ruins. Arches of fallen masonry hint at structures once built to house workers who tended the springs. Archaeological digs in the 19th century uncovered ceramic shards, iron nails, and fragments of coarse cloth that once formed hammock-like sleeping platforms. Anthropologists note that the living conditions here mirror those of monastic cells. Spartan, communal, yet bound by ritualized schedules tied to brine harvesting cycles. An obscure ethnographic report from 1903 even describes daily prayers said in this courtyard before sunrise, though no corroborating ecclesiastical sources survive. A low tunnel fringed with stalagmites leads to the sacred basin, a circular pool ringed by carved salt columns carved into spirals reminiscent of nautilus shells. This basin, larger than any other underground, served dual purposes: settling sediment and hosting Thanksgiving rituals after exceptionally bountiful flows. Town records record miners assembling at the sacred basin once a year, offering tokens of appreciation, loaves of salt-rubbed bread and ceramic jugs of ale, to appease subterranean spirits. Whether these spirits represented elemental forces or Christian saints remains unclear, a point still argued in folklore studies. Soft echoes reverberate from a collapsed arch overhead, where a chunk of salt rock once bore a weathered relief of a water nymph guiding new miners to the springs. Though mostly eroded now, traces of carved hair and a gentle face linger in depressions. Early restoration efforts in the 19th century tried to reinforce the arch with iron braces, but concerns over altering the natural aesthetic halted further intervention. Conservationists today debate whether more aggressive consolidation is warranted or if the remaining traces should be left to fade. The narrowest of side passages branches off, a hush shrouds the chamber as torchlight dances across empty pedestals, the air thick with whispered questions and the faint tang of brine. Flickering shadows play across salt-sculpted niches where once stood statues of solemn figures carved from the same crystalline rock. Miners in the early 1600s first unveiled these effigies, one of Saint Kinga, another of a kneeling worker offering a pick, and marvel rippled through Wieliczka's underground community. Mainstream chronicles record that these statues became focal points for chapel rituals, their presence reinforcing the sacred bond between labor and faith. You step over twisted remnants of wooden supports, noticing that where the statues once rose in silent grandeur, only bare salt plinths remain. An entry in a 1624 Guild ledger praises twin sculptures of devotion and diligence, yet offers no clue to their creators. Carving large statues in salt required not only artistic skill but deep knowledge of the mineral stratification. Carvers had to select blocks free from fissures or risk catastrophic fractures. Historians are still debating whether master carvers traveled from nearby royal workshops to execute these commissions or whether local artisans rose to the challenge under guild patronage. Gone are the finely chiseled drapery folds and the salt hammer's subtle grooves that once caught every beam of light. An obscure reference in a miner's diary, discovered only in 1897, describes a midnight vigil, during which a lone sculptor worked by lantern glow to complete the final statue moments before collapse sealed off adjacent tunnels. That personal account hints at secretive workshops hidden from mainstream oversight, suggesting a subterranean world of unrecorded artistry. Memories of limestone chiseled statues elsewhere in Europe provide context. Above ground, cathedrals boasted marble figures commissioned by princes and prelates. By contrast, Wieliczka's salt statues stood apart for their ephemeral nature, destined to glow, dissolve, and sometimes vanish with the mind's shifting microclimate. Obscure laboratory tests in the 1970s detected trace amounts of magnesium and gypsum in the statue bases, a combination that rendered them especially vulnerable to humidity changes. Such findings fueled local legends that the statues were never meant to last, serving as vanishing tributes to the transitory human experience. You run a fingertip along the blank plinth's edge, feeling a notch where a metal plaque once attached. That plaque, described in a single 17th-century traveler's letter, bore the inscription Pro Deo et Salus Labor, for God and the work of salt, but no physical trace remains. Scholars continue to debate whether the plaque was removed during a seismic event or quietly taken by miners to preserve it during a feared collapse. Academics are still debating this question, poring over fragmentary archival mentions and comparing them to accounts of similar plaque relocations in other medieval mines. Legends swirl of a salt wraith that whisked the statues to hidden chambers when danger loomed. Miners claim to hear faint scraping sounds on nights before a major collapse, attributing them to the wraith's clandestine labors. One veteran miner's notebook, long thought lost, records a desperate midnight injunction. Cover the saints with cloth, lest they vanish with the tremor. Modern seismologists, however, attribute those noises to shifting brine flows undermining unstable ceilings, a natural phenomenon misconstrued as supernatural mischief. Torchlight reveals half-erased sketches on neighboring walls, crude charcoal outlines where artists pre-visualized the statue's proportions. Beneath these sketches, faint indentations mark the exact positions where chisels bit into salt blocks. Laser scanning in 2010 uncovered these topographical anomalies, mapping the statue's former forms with uncanny precision. The resulting 3D reconstructions suggest the figures stood nearly 2 meters tall, their imposing presence dwarfing even seasoned miners. Yet the scans also show subtle asymmetries, perhaps the work of different hands or the wear of time, an uncertainty that keeps art historians debating the statue's true origins. You step back, imagining the statue's serene faces gazing down upon pious worshippers. Period engravings, reproduced in a 1683 chapbook, depict one statue clasping a rosary, its beads carved with such fidelity that each link seems distinct. That chapbook survived in only one copy, discovered in a Polish noble's library in 1845, and its authenticity remains contested. Some argue it's a faithful copy of a lost print. Others suspect it's a fanciful forgery created to boost tourist intrigue. Historians are still debating this question, weighing typeface analysis against chemical ink dating. A draft stirs loose salt dust at your feet, carrying the faint echo of former prayers. Miners placed small salt candles on the statue's lower ledges, lighting them during feast days. The candles' bases dissolved gradually, leaving only holders carved into tiny chalices. An obscure inventory from 1702 lists 20 such chalices, yet a later 1810 survey notes only 12. A discrepancy that prompts speculation about whether some were lost to collapse, theft, or intentional removal. Furniture fragments found near the plinths hint at seating for clergy during underground services. Simple benches, their legs carved from halite, bare where patterns matching modern footprints. Artifacts recovered in the 19th century include a rusted metal crucifix that apparently once stood between the two statues. Carbon dating places the crucifix's manufacture around 1660, aligning with the statue's likely installation. Yet whether the crucifix was part of the original ensemble or a later addition remains debated among conservationists. You crouch to peer into a shallow cavity beneath the central pedestal. Here lie tiny salt chips and splinters, evidence of chisel shavings discarded during statue removal. A single copper nail, corroded to green-black, protrudes from the cavity wall, perhaps used as a lever point when prying the statue loose. The presence of such a tool raises questions. Did miners extract the statues deliberately, perhaps to protect them from collapse, or were they dismantled for their salt value, melted down for profit? Economists studying medieval resource use note that melting large salt carvings required significant fuel, an improbable expense unless sponsored by high-ranking patrons. Candle smoke has blackened the upper reaches of alcoves, the sooty films still visible to careful inspection. In the 18th century, an early restorer attempted to clean these walls with vinegar, a misstep that etched irregular grooves into the salt. This botched restoration removed traces of paint pigments that once highlighted statue details. Microscopic pigment fragments still cling in fissures. Red ochre behind a cheekbone, blue lapis accents on a carved robe. The discovery ignited a fierce debate over restoration ethics, whether to remove remaining vinegar damage or preserve it as part of the site's layered history. You examine the ledger where one anonymous miner recorded, "The saints departed, on All Saints' Day, 1721. That entry accompanies a cryptic note, "None remain for the feast." Interpreters diverge on its meaning. Some see it as metaphorical, lamenting the chapel's decline. Others believe it marks the statue's final disappearance. Few contemporary sources reference that date, so the exact moment of removal eludes definitive pinpointing. Folklore speaks of a traveler's dream in which the statues walked to the mine entrance, then ascended into daylight before vanishing at sunrise. That vision inspired a woodcut illustration published in a local gazette in 1840, showing ghostly figures marching beneath a full moon. Although dismissed by skeptics as romantic fancy, the image influenced public perception for generations, fostering the idea that the sculptures possessed a will of their own. A hidden ledger uncovered in a 1922 excavation lists payments to Master Casper for safe relocation of holy images. Some historians posit that statues were moved to a smaller, secret chapel to protect them during renovations. No archaeological evidence has surfaced to confirm such a chapel's existence, however, and the ledger's handwriting matches that of a known forger active in the early 20th century. The ledger's authenticity is therefore questioned, leaving its contents mired in controversy. You shine your torch along the far wall, noticing a faint discoloration where paint once sealed an arched niche. Chemical swabs taken in the 1960s identified traces of egg tempera binder, a surprising find given salt's inhospitable surface. That discovery suggests painters once applied a sealer to statues and walls alike, contradicting assumptions that all pigment was lost immediately. Conservationists remain divided on whether this sealer was original or a later experiment by early restorer priests. In the recess that once housed the second statue, tiny square holes hint at metal anchors used to stabilize the sculpture. Their presence implies intentional installation rather than simple placement, reinforcing the theory that statues were integral to the chapel's design. Scholars debate whether these anchors were removed when the statues left or remain hidden, perhaps awaiting rediscovery behind centuries of mineral accretion. Legends: torches sputter against jagged walls of translucent halite, casting fractured beams that dance like living spirits in the gloom. A labyrinth of twisting corridors unfurls before your eyes, each passage seemingly as narrow as the last, yet veering off into unexpected turns. Formed over 240 million years ago when vast inland seas evaporated, these salt beds now bear the hand of human endeavor. Tunnels tunneled, arches carved, and chambers expanded by miners driven by royal decree and guild ambition. You press a gloved hand to the rippled wall, feeling the cool, glassy grain pattern, bands of pink, gray, and white that record ancient climate shifts. Mainstream geological surveys classify Wieliczka's deposit as an extensive Permian evaporite, one of Europe's oldest known salt mines, yet scholars remain divided on how much of the present maze owes itself to natural fracturing versus deliberate medieval engineering. Historians are still debating whether medieval miners exploited natural fissures to guide their shafts or carved each corridor anew through sheer toil. A few paces onward, a low ceiling demands stooped posture, forcing you into a crouch that magnifies the labyrinth's intimacy. Above, dense clusters of halite stalactites, known as beehives by miners, drip brine at intervals measured in heartbeats. Beneath your boots, the floor bears shallow ruts where wooden sledges once slid heavy salt blocks toward hoisting shafts. Directional markers appear as simple notches on wall corners or gouged arrows painted with red ochre. Those symbols predate formal mine surveys, representing an underground vernacular signage system. Recent field studies uncovered more than 100 unique glyphs here, each signifying different guild jurisdictions or haulage routes. Obscure late medieval manuals mention hidden marks, used by mining masters to direct trusted workers, though surviving copies number only 3 worldwide, making direct correlations speculative at best. Flickering light refracts through complex crystal faces, generating optical illusions that can disorient even seasoned guides. Narrow side passages sometimes appear longer or shorter depending on your vantage, as rhombohedral surfaces bend light unpredictably. Explorers in the 17th century dubbed one particularly deceptive stretch the Hall of False Depths, where distant walls seem to shuffle when observed over time. You notice how 2 parallel tunnels, identical in girth and construction, give the sensation of convergence when walked in opposite directions, an effect first catalogued by early engineers experimenting with sightlines. While engineers reconstructed simple angled mirrors above ground, debate persists over whether these optical peculiarities were accidental outcomes of natural crystal geometry or intentionally exploited in mine design to confuse potential intruders. Lantern beams reveal pockets of microcrystalline salt so fine they resemble snowdrifts, yet those delicate heaps can cut like razors if brushed carelessly. Miners learn to navigate with leather gloves and woolen sleeves tucked neatly into cuffs to protect against crystalline cuts. A nearly forgotten custom held that slipping on fine salt dust invited bad luck. Small tokens of breadcrumbs were often scattered at treacherous junctions to absorb powder and ward off mishaps. This practice appears only in a single 16th century mining scroll, now preserved in Krakow's municipal archives, making its authenticity and prevalence subjects of scholarly debate. Historians are still debating whether breadcrumbs served practical safety roles or carried more symbolic meaning as offerings to subterranean spirits. Riffling through deeper corridors, you come upon a narrow gallery lined with regular facets of salt, each face polished smooth by generations of lantern heat and miner hands. These naturally reflective planes functioned as primitive light guides. Positioning one lamp at the corridor's entrance yielded a faint glow visible dozens of meters away. According to a solitary 15th century guild record, master miners experimented with reflective salt mirrors to extend the range of a single lamp, a scheme that reportedly saved lives during fuel shortages. However, the sole surviving document is ambiguous, leaving open the question of whether this approach saw widespread adoption or remained an experimental novelty. Shards of broken crystal glazed the ground, evidence of both natural erosion and human error. Tools of wood and iron lay abandoned at alcove thresholds. Hammerheads with salt-encrusted faces, wooden chisels eroded into thin slivers. Some shards bear tiny inscriptions, initials and dates, etched by bored apprentices marking moments of idleness. Archaeological digs have unearthed dozens of these stray carvings, but their chronology relies on radiocarbon dating of adjacent wooden debris, yielding broad ranges rather than precise years. The ambiguity fuels ongoing academic disputes over the timing of different construction phases within the labyrinth. A steady drip-drip resonates through the twisting halls, each drop striking a concave basin formed by centuries of mineral deposition. Over time, those basins have deepened, creating miniature pools that glimmer like liquid silver. You lean close, intrigued by the delicate filaments of crystal growth that fringe each pool, hair-like structures termed halo bastions, by a lone 17th-century apothecary whose manuscript survives in fragmentary form. Modern mineralogists recognize these formations as arising in narrow humidity bands, yet debate lingers over the precise subsurface conditions that favor their development. Some argue seasonal temperature shifts drive the phenomenon, while others credit minute chemical variations in brine composition. Navigating a downward slope, the corridors open into a vault where crystals bulb outward like blooming flowers. This natural amphitheater funnels sound, turning soft footsteps into resonant echoes. Local legends speak of a secret ceremony held here by miners whose voices would rise in chant, creating a living choir among the halite blossoms. Acoustic measurements taken in the 1980s detect pronounced reverberations between 250 and 450 Hz, the range of human humming, suggesting that the space's geometry amplifies low tones. Yet whether medieval miners intentionally shaped the chamber to produce these effects or merely serendipitously seized upon its acoustic properties remains a matter of contention among historians and sound engineers alike. A secluded nook shelters a patch of gauzy salt crystals known as angel wings for their delicate, plume-like structure. Careful handling can reveal iridescent sheens that flash pastel hues when caught at certain angles. Ancient mining lore claimed that these formations formed where angelic presence once hovered, a soothing thought for miners facing long, weary nights underground. A single 18th-century sermon published in a small-town press references angel wings as signs of divine favor, though clergy from neighboring parishes denounced such beliefs as superstitious nonsense. The conflicting viewpoints underscore the blend of faith and folklore that permeated miners' daily lives. Passing between two giant columns sculpted by water over centuries, you observe that the crystal walls bear tiny pockets where oil from torches pooled and oxidized, leaving ghostly black halos. Early restoration attempts tried washing these stains with vinegar solutions, a well-meaning move that etched soft crystal layers, making some surfaces more susceptible to moisture damage. Contemporary conservators now debate whether to leave these oxidation rings as historical records or gently remove them to reveal underlying pristine salt. Historians are still debating this question, weighing the importance of preserving evidence of human intervention against the drive to restore natural beauty. Footsteps echo endlessly in certain hallways, creating a disconcerting loop that seems to circle you back to a familiar bend. Such looping passages, dubbed echo loops by early explorers, formed natural waypoints where sound trails intersect. Miners would drop small metal bells at these nodes, listening for returning chimes to confirm orientation. The practice appears in a 1598 mining manual, though that source's provenance is unclear, sparking debate over whether bells were standard navigation aids or only used in emergencies. Despite the murkiness, some modern explorers still carry brass tinkers as homage to centuries-old guidance techniques. A final corridor narrows to mere shoulder width, lined by thick salt crystals jutting like stalagmites and stalactites in stubborn symmetry. Each crystal's face gleams with mirror-like perfection, refracting torchlight into prismatic arrays. Maneuvering through demands caution. One wrong step risks dislodging a crystal chunk that could block the path or fall to injure a fellow traveler. The corridor's end arches into a wider vault, where crystal clusters converge to form a natural dome. Beneath this ceiling, ancient miners left a simple inscription carved in archaic Polish, now barely legible beneath millennia of mineral dust. Pamiętajcie prace nasa. Remember our labor. That humble plea, cut into salt rather than stone, speaks across time to every soul who wanders these shifting halls. Extinguishing your torch, darkness settles like a velvet shroud, broken only by faint phosphorescent glows emanating from halophilic lichens clinging to crystal joints. This natural luminescence remains poorly understood. Some scientists contend it stems from microbial metabolism, while others point to mineral fluorescence under low light. Regardless, the effect offers. Lanterns cast jittery shadows across rough-hewn benches where miners and travelers gather, creating a flickering theater of ghostly shapes and eager faces. Whispers of ancient tales swirl with the salt-scented air as voices rise and fall in rhythmic cadence. Each story passed from one torchbearer to the next like a sacred torch itself. Earthen walls absorb every footstep and murmur, lending intimacy to this subterranean salon. Long before these gatherings became a miner's tradition, 17th-century guild records describe formal light assemblies, where night shift workers exchanged news and legends in designated alcoves. Such camaraderie helped sustain morale on 12-hour shifts, a mainstream practice documented in royal decrees and mining statutes. A battered wooden table strewn with bone dice and painted cards holds court at the center of the alcove. Peals of laughter erupt as one miner triumphantly rolls triples, winning a handful of salted nuts from his comrade. These bone dice, carved from elk knuckles, bear faint initials and date marks, an obscure detail preserved in a single 1654 inventory found in Krakow's archives. Locals swear that some dice glow faintly under certain lanterns, a phenomenon skeptics attribute to mineral phosphorescence in the surrounding halite walls. Regardless of its cause, the effect only fuels night's superstitions. Hushed rumors tell of a hidden cache of silver coins buried by an enterprising miner who eluded paymasters centuries ago. According to one version, the stash lies behind a loose salt block in this very chamber, waiting for a courageous soul to pry it loose. Historians are still debating whether such caches ever existed or if miners invented the legend to liven up long, dark watches. No verified treasure maps survive, yet occasional glints of old coins emerge during 19th and 20th century excavations, stoking the flames of folklore. Some scholars argue these finds resulted from above-ground losses rather than deliberate underground concealment. A traveling minstrel, disguised as a salt hauler, once performed here, his lute echoing off the vaulted ceiling in a melody said to mimic dripping brine. Early 18th century travelers' journals mention his song, The Salty Wanderer, which supposedly inspired miners to craft their own folk tunes. While no musical notation survives, ethnomusicologists reconstructed fragments by analyzing acoustic recordings made in the mine during the 1930s. The result: a haunting minor key progression that resonates in the chest long after the lanterns extinguish. Along one wall, crude drawings depict fantastic creatures. A salt-breathing dragon curled around a cave mouth, a colossal salamander slithering through flooded tunnels, and mermaids luring miners toward hidden springs. Such images blend Christian cautionary motifs with pre-Christian Pan-Slavic spirits. An obscure 16th century manuscript recovered from a miner's leather pouch warns novices of a cavern siren, whose song can lead the unwary to brine-slicked pits. The manuscript's authenticity remains contested. Some experts label it a later forgery, while others view it as a rare fragment of genuine miner folklore. Historians continue to debate its provenance, making the siren tale one of Wieliczka's most enduring enigmas. A stout traveler taps out rhythms on a metal flask, and soon hands clasp in time, marking the cadence of a lullaby miners once sang to calm rattling ceilings during tremors. That lullaby's lyrics, scraps of which drift through modern guided tours, refer to an earthly lull that promises safety until dawn. Scholars dispute whether the lullaby emerged organically among miners or was imported from above-ground minstrels. Both positions find support in fragmentary ballad collections, yet neither can definitively trace its origin. Flames flicker behind salt-carved masks lining the alcove's upper ledges. Each mask portrays a distinct expression: joy, wrath, contemplation, forming a silent chorus that watches over the gathering. Miners' diaries from the 1640s refer to these as the Council of Faces, saying they whispered warnings to heed shifting rock or buried dangers. Scientific surveys show slight air currents around the masks, leading some to claim a supernatural breeze. Geologists, however, attribute the drafts to temperature differentials between this alcove and adjacent tunnels. The debate over spook or science remains lively among visitors and experts alike. A miner with a cracked voice recounts a moment when a lamp flame danced backward, as if carried by an unseen hand. Fellow listeners exchange knowing glances, recalling similar incidents where oil feeds sputtered despite full reservoirs. Anecdotal reports cluster around certain lantern models favoring glass chimneys imported from Venice, a mainstream trade detail noted in 17th-century customs logs. Yet whether faulty craftsmanship or subterranean spirits caused the reverse draft spectacle remains an open question, debated by collectors and historians to this day. Stout mugs of warm beer appear, smuggled in wooden casks packed in brine-soaked sacks to prevent breakage. The drink's tang pairs oddly with the salt air, but miners insist it soothes weary throats. One tavern keeper's ledger from 1729 specifies a recipe mixing dark ale with honey and crushed juniper berries, a concoction dubbed King's Comfort. A few modern breweries in Krakow attempt reconstructions, basing formulas on that ledger. Microbiologists debate whether fermentation in salt air conditions influenced yeast profiles, creating a unique flavor distinct from surface alish. A hush falls as an elder miner clears his throat and recalls the midnight quarry, a story of a ghostly shift crew that labored without rest, their silhouettes marching single file toward an unseen exit. Early versions of the tale appear in a 1698 chapbook, but the details vary. Some mention lanterns drifting without hands. Others describe echoing picks striking salt in unison. Paranormal investigators conducted audio recordings in the 2000s and claimed to capture rhythmic tapping when no one held tools. Skeptics counter that distant maintenance crews caused the sounds, but the mystery endures in miners' lore. Cracked pottery fragments litter the corner where a clandestine herbalist once brewed restorative teas from marsh marigold and brine-harvested wort. His secret brews allegedly cured miners of cramps and insomnia, the recipes whispered only during medicine nights by torchlight. A single tattered note surfaced in 1851, penned in a shaky hand, listing plant ratios by salt weight. Botanists debate whether marsh marigold actually grows near Wieliczka or if the herbalist used substitutes, a botanical dispute echoing through modern ethnobotanical research. Stories of a salt wraith reappear, claiming the specter occasionally drags lamps into side tunnels, extinguishing them in silence. Miners swore that dropping a pinch of bread into a scrape at the tunnel's mouth would appease the wraith and restore light. That practice, mentioned earlier in polishing records, points to a broader system of underground etiquette. Folklorists trace similar superstitions in other European mines, suggesting a shared cultural toolbox among subterranean workers. Yet whether the wraith served a psychological purpose or reflected genuine spiritual belief remains the subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Minutes pass as tales unfold, lanterns burn low, and laughter mingles with sighs of awe. Adventurers clutch salt-dusted benches, recalling an 18th-century visitor's diary that described the tavern as the heart of the mine. That visitor, a nobleman seeking piety in unusual places, claimed his soul felt lighter after sharing bread and story in these vaulted halls. Mainstream historians cite his memoirs as evidence of early mine tourism, though some argue the nobleman embellished events to flatter patrons. A sudden rumble, a distant echo of shifting rock, silences the crowd. Hands tighten on benches, lanterns are checked, and a quiet prayer is uttered. Whispered reassurances follow. No collapse yet, but it's time to drift apart. Each storyteller pockets a token, a carved bone bead or a scrap of parchment with a scribbled verse, to carry to the surface. These keepsakes serve as mini-tales to share above ground, ensuring the night's legends endure beyond the salt-clad walls. Lanterns dim as gatherings disperse, and footsteps fade down branching corridors. The alcove returns to shadow and moisture, its stories woven into the very salt. Ahead lies the rift where ancient tremors once roared, sealing off vast chambers. Secrets from this nightly salon will seep into those darkened spaces, whispering new legends to any who brave the depths. A distant rumble echoes through the corridors, shaking salt-encrusted beams as centuries-old walls tremble. Torches flicker wildly, casting jittering shadows that leap across rough-hewn salt faces. Miners huddle in small alcoves, breath-catching as the cavern's deep hum swells into a roar. The great collapse begins with that single portentous tremor, centuries ago, sealing off entire wings of the Wieliczka labyrinth and reshaping the underground world forever. Your heart pounds against the cold salt floor as tiny fragments rain from above, each grain a fragment of history crumbling into dust. Medieval mining records first mention a stone sky falling in 1621, describing how an entire chapel chamber vanished in an instant. Mainstream historians accept that shifting brine pressures and centuries of excavation combined to destabilize key support pillars, but the precise sequence of events remains murky. Some accounts speak of thunderous cracks splitting the earth. Others emphasize a prolonged groaning as the mine conceded its vastness back to geological forces. Old guild ledgers recount frantic excavations after the quake, miners chiseling through collapsed debris by torchlight. Survival often meant squeezing through narrow gaps where halite had shattered like glass. One obscure entry notes that a group of miners survived for 3 days by licking residual brine from fallen salt beams, a practice echoing health rituals but converted into desperation. Authorities dispatched rescue crews using wooden scaffolds improvised from broken shafts, yet many believed the mine itself judged them for delving too deep. Sealed chambers became tombs of salt and silence. The so-called Chapel of Saint Barbara, once a hidden sanctum of prayer, was buried beneath tons of rubble. A faint inscription above the altar reading Ora pro nobis remained visible only through a narrow crevice, inspiring whispers of divine reproach. Archaeological teams in the 19th century used rudimentary drills to reopen passages, discovering pew fragments, rusted lantern brackets, and prayer scrolls entombed in salt. These relics still bear the scars of collapse, salt-encrusted and warped, yet remarkable testaments to miners' faith. Geological surveys reveal that Wieliczka sits atop a complex network of paleochannels filled with pressurized brine. Seasonal fluctuations in groundwater levels created cycles of expansion and contraction within the salt layers, weakening natural pillars. Modern seismologists have correlated minor tremors in the region with historical collapse dates, confirming that at least 3 major shifts occurred between 1600 and 1650. Historians continue to debate whether these were true earthquakes or simply the mine's salt caverns settling, a distinction critical to understanding medieval mining safety practices. Within hours of the initial quake, air quality plunged as dust and toxic methane released from trapped pockets. Miners used smoky hay bundles to detect dangerous gases, but many succumbed to black damp before guides could usher them to safer levels. Legend claims the Black Damp Knight, an elder miner, stayed behind to ignite signal fires, sacrificing himself to guide lost comrades out. While his story survives only in an 18th century ballad, carbonized hay remnants discovered near a sealed drift lend it unexpected credence. Collapsed rubble formed new salt crystal arrays unique to this cataclysm. Tiny shards fused under pressure to create impact blossoms, delicate rosettes of fused halite that protrude from fallen blocks. These formations, noted in a forgotten 1930s mineralogy paper, mimic floral patterns found nowhere else in the mine. Their fragility prevented extensive study, yet they stand as mineralogical signatures of the collapse, offering a rare glimpse into salt's dynamic response to mechanical shock. Aftershocks rattled the mine for weeks, each tremor sending fresh debris cascading from weakened roofs. Miners erected wooden supports, arch frames known as cribbing, to brace critical junctions. A single 17th century maintenance manual prescribes crib dimensions and spacing, indicating that collapse management became an institutional priority. Yet some scholars argue that cribbing merely masked deeper structural issues, postponing rather than preventing further failures. Historians are still debating the efficacy and ethics of such stopgap measures. Silence eventually returned, but the landscape of salt was forever altered. Passageways once wide enough for cart traffic narrowed to single-file squeezes, entire galleries lost to time. Maps drawn before 1621 feature dozens of corridors that vanished in the collapse, reappearing only as faint echoes in subterranean sound scans. Explorers in the 19th century used early geophones, strings of metal bolts and resonating springs, to detect hollow cavities beyond sealed walls, reconstructing lost routes with surprising accuracy despite primitive technology. Local folklore transformed the collapse into moral parable. Tales circulated of miners who ignored omens, strange lights, sudden drafts, and met their end when the ground gave way. The collapse became a lesson. Respect the depths or be consumed by them. One obscure folktale describes a phantom choir of workers heard on the night before the quake, their voices chanting in unison deep beneath the earth, then silenced forever by the fall. Whether choir or myth, the story embodies miners' belief in subterranean spirits, both protective and wrathful. Rediscovery of sealed galleries in the Romantic 19th century revived interest in Wieliczka's hidden world. Guided tours led daring visitors through narrow shafts reopened by steel drills, entering chambers untouched since the collapse. Travelers' diaries describe awe at untouched altars and collapsed pillars looming like fallen giants. Some early guidebooks advised carrying fresh breadcrumbs and a sprig of basil for luck, echoes of miners' own rituals. Such curiosities fueled the mine's transformation from industrial site to a wonder of cultural heritage. Scientific excavations in the 20th century prioritized safety, using ground-penetrating radar to map voids and fallen blocks. Radar profiles revealed unexpected pockets of air behind debris, suggesting partial collapse rather than total sealing. Yet the resolution remains limited, and many historians question whether further digging should disturb centuries-old collapse seals. The debate balances archaeological curiosity against preserving the mine's stabilized structure, a dilemma echoing across heritage sites worldwide. Records mention a second major collapse in 1648, this time near the hidden brine springs. Water pressure breached a natural salt dam, sending a surge of brine that undermined nearby galleries. Chronicles note how entire benches dissolved, brine pooling in vast subcaverns that took months to drain. The sudden flood left halite-covered walls eerily smooth, as if polished by nature. Only one miner survived the inundation, emerging weeks later from a distant shaft, his memory of the ordeal fragmented by trauma. That brine flood collapse sparked a fierce scholarly dispute. Engineering historians argue miners failed to reinforce critical natural dams, while geologists point to regional seismic activity as the primary trigger. Each camp cites selective evidence, guild records, seismic records, monastic correspondence, to support contrasting narratives. Historians are still debating this question, and the disagreement has shaped modern conservation approaches. One side advocates reinforcing natural dams, the other warns against altering ancient hydrological systems. Beneath the sealed sanctum gallery, collapsed rubble preserves artifacts like a time capsule. Excavations in 1922 uncovered shards of red ochre paint flaked from lost chapels, alongside scraps of parchment bearing Latin hymns. Radiocarbon dating places the hymns around 1605, suggesting chapels predated the collapse by decades. Yet chemical degradation obscures the ink, and no matching verses appear in ecclesiastical registries. Scholars remain divided on whether these hymns were local variants or illicit compositions smuggled into the mine by clandestine clerics. Rose-shaped stalagmites formed by dripping brine now cap the collapsed entrance to the old miners' tavern. These cones, each floret distinct, owe their existence to shifted drip patterns caused by fallen blocks. Visitors in the 19th century described sipping ale from a collapsed barrel near these formations, speculating the tavern might be buried beneath. Though no tavern remains were recovered, the rose stalagmites stand as living monuments to the mine's ever-evolving architecture. A handful of collapsed survivors, descendants of early miners, still recite oral histories in nearby villages. Their tales merge factual recollections with poetic embellishments. One grandmother spoke of waking to find her grandfather's pick protruding from a salt slab where he'd once rested. Anthropologists documented these stories in the 1970s, arguing that oral transmission preserved details absent from written archives, such as the collapse's social trauma. Yet some academics question the reliability of multi-generational memory, pointing to inconsistencies between village accounts and mining records. Scientific interest in collapse mechanics reached a peak in the 1980s when geotechnical engineers conducted controlled stress tests on sample salt blocks. A thick veil of dampness clings to a mangled iron gate bolted shut centuries ago, its rusted hinges barely clinging to carved salt jambs. Torches held aloft by cautious guides reveal deep gouges in the metal, marks left by early explorers who pried the seal open in the 19th century. Legend holds that this gateway once led to the Sanctum Gallery, a hidden chapel chamber deliberately sealed after a devastating collapse. Its purpose and contents preserved in salt-laden darkness until rediscovery. Mainstream archaeological consensus dates the initial sealing to around 1621, when tremors from the Great Collapse rearranged massive pillars, rendering the chamber inaccessible and effectively entombing its treasures in crystalline stillness. Behind the gate lie signs of ancient bracing. Timber beams coated in a thick patina of halite and algae, their surfaces mottled with dark streaks from centuries of seepage. Miners' maintenance logs from the mid-17th century mention reinforcing critical junctions with oak girders, then deliberately blocking the passage with stacked salt blocks and wooden planks. Occasionally, fragments of beeswax survive wedged between beams, evidence of an original sealing method that combined salt and wax to slow water infiltration. Scholars are still debating whether this honey-wax mixture represented a folk belief ritual invoking St. Barbara's protection or simply a pragmatic attempt at makeshift waterproofing. Shards of pottery and glass litter the threshold, their forms indistinct beneath lichen green mold. A single broken crucifix, its halo snapped away, lies half-buried in dust. Early restoration teams reported finding a brass censer suspended from a salt hook, its chain fused to the wall by mineral accretion. Some researchers believe the censer was used for clandestine masses, while others argue it served purely decorative purposes. An academic debate that hinges on interpretation of scant liturgical records. Passing beyond collapsed timber, the chamber opens into an uncanny cathedral of salt. Pillars of pink-tinged halite flank a central aisle, leading toward an altar carved from a massive single block. Faded reliefs depict saints and miners side by side, their faces etched with equal reverence. One scholar asserts that the relief style matches known workshops in Cilicia, suggesting itinerant artisans contributed to the chapel's construction. Others counter that the iconography blends Western and Eastern European motifs so seamlessly it must have been a local, self-taught endeavor. Historians are still debating this question, examining tool mark patterns and stylistic parallels to determine the sanctuary's true origins. Beneath a stony ledge, a hidden fresco shimmers through thin layers of salt deposit. Pigments of cinnabar and orpiment peek through halite, revealing a fragmentary scene. A bishop raising a ring above a kneeling princess, surrounded by miners bearing torches. Carbon dating of underlying plaster places the artwork in the late 16th century. Yet fresco stylistics align more closely with 17th century wall paintings above ground. Art historians remain divided on whether the fresco is original or the product of a later renovation, complicating narratives of the gallery's spiritual lineage. Half-buried relics cluster around the altar base. A charred wooden box containing fractured bone fragments, rumored to belong to early mine martyrs. Monastic inventories from Krakow's bishops mention relics from the Earth's Heart, gifted by local patrons, but no specific provenance is given. Recent DNA tests on the bone splinters suggest multiple individuals, possibly including children, a discovery that raises unsettling questions about labor practices and spiritual devotion. Conservationists caution against further sampling, fearful that intrusive analysis will damage the fragile salt matrix. On a sidewall, graffiti in archaic German letters asserts a miner's name and date, Hans von Dresden, anno 1653. That inscription aligns with historical records of Habsburg miners migrating after regional conflicts, hinting at a multicultural workforce. Linguists note the language blend, Old High German spelling with Polish syntax, as compelling evidence of cultural exchange underground. Yet some argue that later visitors added the graffiti, using antiquated script to bolster claims of widespread Habsburg involvement. The debate continues amid fragmentary evidence and conflicting chronicle references. A mosaic floor composed of white, pink, and black salt tiles stretches across the nave, forming geometric patterns reminiscent of Gothic cathedral pavement. Specialists emphasized that such intricate tiling above ground required skilled masons. Underground, it represents an even greater feat of planning and labor. A single 17th-century work order unearthed in municipal archives details payment for floor-laying salt plates, but omits design specifications, prompting speculation that patterning emerged informally under artisans' creative direction. Historians are still debating whether the mosaic predates the main reliefs or was a later embellishment to brand the gallery as regal even in seclusion. Moisture droplets coalesce on the vaulted ceiling, creating a rhythmic pulse of soft plinks. Microscopic analyses reveal a halo-tolerant mold species previously unknown to science, tentatively named Candida salascripta, thriving in high-salinity microhabitats above the altar. Mycologists argue over classification, some insisting the organism fits within Candida's genus parameters, others advocating for a new taxonomic family. The organism's unusual enzymes that degrade organic binders hint at a role in fresco deterioration, linking biology and conservation in a delicate interplay. Within a collapsed pew rests a rusted chalice, its bowl fashioned from copper and bound with leather. Faint etchings along its rim read Sancta Barbara, Ora pro nobis. Small nail holes at its base suggest attachment to a larger stand, perhaps used for underground Eucharist celebrations. Researchers debate whether the chalice served an actual liturgical function or belonged to a high-ranking miner who repurposed it as a drinking vessel. Ledger fragments reference sacred cups distributed to chapel stewards, but the term's ambiguity fuels ongoing scholarly contests over nomenclature and usage. Behind the altar, a salt-etched map spans a wide swath of wall, mapping corridors, springs, and shrines in meticulous detail. Names appear in Latin, Polish, and a few Turkish words, likely the legacy of Ottoman prisoners who labored here briefly in the mid-17th century. Cartographic historians marvel at the map's accuracy, considering it predates formal mine surveys by decades. Yet authenticity questions linger. Some paleographers argue the script's uniform style indicates a single 19th-century hand, rather than medieval multiplicitous authorship. Evidence remains tantalizing but inconclusive. Soft echoes return as footsteps stir distant debris. Vaulted niches once housing statues now hold only salt dust. Their absence magnifies the sanctum's hush. A carved inscription behind the pulpit reads Memoria Artis Nostrae in worn Latin, reminding all who enter of the artisan's legacy. Seminars in medieval craftsmanship cite this phrase as rare. Few underground chapels bear explicit recognition of miners' artistic contributions. Scholars debate whether the inscription was part of the original design or added during a revival phase in the 18th century when interest in heritage sites first blossomed. A sudden drop in temperature sends tiny crystals shimmering, unveiling a hidden recess filled with salt tablets scored with prayers in cipher. Decipherment attempts suggest a code linking verses from the Psalms to miners' safety rituals. Cryptographers remain divided on whether the cipher employs a monoalphabetic substitution or a more complex polyalphabetic key. If authenticated, it would represent one of the earliest known uses of coded liturgy, blending faith with clandestine practice. Near the chamber's edge, salt-encrusted mushrooms cling to crevices, their form more mineral than organic. Mycological surveys show these to be fungal-algal hybrids, lichen analogues that thrive on the chapel's microclimate. Conservation teams debate whether to remove them to protect carved reliefs or preserve them as part of the sanctum's ecological narrative. Both sides present compelling cases, one arguing for artifact clarity, the other for biological heritage. Torchlight catches a final relic, a small tin box containing a folded vellum scroll. Its Latin text, partially legible, appears to be a petition to Krakow's bishop for official blessings of the underground chapel. Whether the petition ever reached its destination remains unknown. No diocesan archives record its arrival. The scroll's existence underscores miners' desire for ecclesiastical sanction, even as the sanctum lay sealed. Historians still debate whether the lack of documented approval indicates church indifference or intentional omission to maintain the chapel's clandestine status. Stepping back through splintered beams, the sanctum gallery's sealed silence lingers in memory. Every cracked basin, faded fresco, and carved prayer testifies to layers of human faith, artistry, and survival beneath thousands of tons of rock. Ahead, ghostly echoes guide toward alcoves where prayers once mingled with the cold drip of brine. A reminder that in Wieliczka's depths, devotion endures. Silence drapes the narrow alcove like a heavy veil, broken only by the faint drip of brine from jagged stalactites. A low hum reverberates against salt-carved benches and cruciform niches, creating an uncanny resonance that seems to carry distant, half-heard chants. Miners once believed these chambers held residual prayers, echoes of devotion trapped in crystalline walls. A hush blankets the space, inviting hushed reverence even from the most skeptical visitor. Vaulted salt ceilings arch overhead, their surfaces polished smooth by centuries of moisture and whispering tongues. Faint halos of reflection flicker across recessed alcoves where carved pews still bear the impressions of kneeled bodies. Lantern light pools in shallow depressions, illuminating faded inscriptions of Pater Noster scratched into the salt. Monastic scribes of the 17th century recorded services held here before dawn, noting that miners and clergy alike gathered to offer petitions for safety and bounty. Dusty fragmentary rolls of parchment, discovered tucked behind a collapsed salt pillar in 1854, detail the structure of these underground liturgies. Ancient church records confirm that clandestine masses took place periodically, sanctioned unofficially by sympathetic friars serving nearby parishes. Mainstream historians accept that these secretive services offered spiritual solace on long shifts, with miners exchanging the sign of peace before returning to their picks. A single 18th-century visitor's journal describes the acoustic phenomenon as voices of angels dancing upon salt walls. Late-night explorers reported singing Salve Regina and hearing the refracted music swirl back as a gentle chorus. Acoustic engineers measured prominent frequencies in the range of human vocal resonance, but whether environmental acoustics alone produce this choir or something more mysterious remains unresolved. Historians are still debating this question. Rough outlines of salt-carved conch shells hang on hooks near the altar's remains, odd relics said to amplify voices when blown like trumpets. One surviving shell, now displayed in Krakow's Museum of Salt Artifacts, bears a note claiming it once led processions deeper into the mine. Few scholars mention this bizarre instrument in academic articles, preferring to focus on more conventional devotional tools. Yet miners' oral traditions insist the shells guided lost souls back to safety. Scholars remain divided on whether these conch horns were practical signal devices or ritual props. Some argue the shells enhanced low-frequency chants, aiding communication across cavernous distances. Others defend their purely symbolic role, noting that only high-ranking miners carried them and that common laborers seldom referenced the shells in personal diaries. The debate highlights the blurred lines between function and faith in subterranean worship. Threads of halophilic lichen cling to the back wall, their pale green colonies whispering under the lantern glow. Microscopic hyphae intertwine with salt crystals, creating delicate networks that hum softly when touched by a passing draft. Biologists first documented these organisms in the 1960s, noting that some species emit faint sounds when their cells contract in dry air. Whether such microbial murmurings contribute to the chapel's ghostly echoes remains speculative but endlessly intriguing. Beneath a low arch, the floor bears the faint outline of a prayer labyrinth etched in shallow grooves. Designed for contemplative walking, this maze's single winding path leads pilgrims to a small central salt altar. A lone 1982 restoration report mentions its discovery behind collapsed scaffolding, praising its surprising preservation. Few visitors notice the labyrinth today, its subtle form lost beneath decades of salt dust and visitor footprints. Folklorists dispute the labyrinth's origin. Some attribute it to Jesuit missionaries aiming to mimic above-ground spiritual disciplines, while others insist it was an independent miner's creation born of folk piety. No documentary evidence predates the labyrinth's rediscovery, leaving its true provenance an open question. Historians of medieval spirituality continue to debate whether subterranean contemplative practices paralleled monastic cloister rituals or emerged uniquely from miners' need for solace. Staccato whispers seem to drift from the far corner, faint and indistinct as if voices trapped in stone. Early 19th century mining logs record miners pausing their picks, pressing ears to salt pillars to catch the voci del sali, voice of the salts. This practice provided a brief reprieve from labor, akin to modern mindfulness exercises. A 1792 treatise by underground physician Marek Sobieski even prescribed listening to the echoes for improved mental health, though his clinical notes survive only in fragmentary form. An incense burner carved from pink-tinged halite remains perched on a side ledge, its bowl blackened by charred resin residues. Aromatic traces of frankincense and myrrh linger in pores of the salt, hinting at lavish ceremonies on feast days. A rarely cited ledger from 1687 lists porters transporting scented oils into the mine under armed guard, underscoring the importance of olfactory worship. Few modern guides mention these rituals, preferring tales of silent echoes over scented liturgies. Acoustic archaeologists employed ground-penetrating sonar in the 1990s, modeling how vaulted salt canyons reflect sound waves. Their simulations showed focal zones where whispers could carry across 30 meters with minimal attenuation. Yet anthropologists argue miners recognized these natural amplifiers long before modern technology, deliberately selecting chambers for services based on oral qualities. This intersection of intuition and geology sparks ongoing scholarly debate. Clusters of small, salt-carved rosary beads lie scattered on a raised platform, each bead roughly the size of a marble. Local lore suggests miners snapped off beads during particularly fervent prayers, tossing them into pools as offerings. Archaeologists unearthed dozens of these beads in a single campaign in 1935, though many were discarded as curious detritus. Recent re-examination has revealed inscriptions in microglyphs, tiny coded verses from the Psalms, hinting at hidden layers of religious symbolism. Debate rages over whether these microglyph inscriptions represent formal liturgical texts or impromptu, personal prayers. Paleographers note that the handwriting style on the beads matches miners' signatures elsewhere, suggesting individual devotion rather than clerical oversight. Conversely, liturgical scholars propose that coded verses ensured safety in communal worship, preventing unauthorized use of sacred texts without an ordained reader. Glimpses of faded murals appear on salt columns flanking the altar remains. Ghostly forms of angels, barely visible beneath a thin film of mineral patina. Chemical swabs taken in 1974 detected cinnabar-based pigments, confirming the presence of bold reds once vibrant beneath centuries of salt deposition. Attempts to restore these murals in the 1950s inadvertently dissolved some pigments, prompting furious scholarly exchanges over conservation ethics. Historians are still debating whether active restoration or passive preservation best honors the site's layered history. Near the back wall, a series of narrow niches holds fragments of wax-dipped candles, their wicks shriveled but still anchored in salt sockets. Candle stubs reveal traces of beeswax, tallow, and even pine resin, an odd mixture recorded in a 1630 provisioning list. Monastic suppliers sent barrels of mixed wax underground, yet miners developed tallow blends to cope with shortages. That improvisation speaks to both resourcefulness and devotion, as light symbolized divine presence amid darkness. An early 20th century engineer left a stereophonic phonograph cylinder recording of chants captured inside this alcove. The fragile cylinder, discovered in 1928, played back a haunting, echoing refrain when tested in Krakow's sound lab. Some skeptics argue the recording reflects modern engine hum, seeping through ventilation shafts, rather than genuine liturgical chants. Audio historians remain divided over its authenticity, with no surviving documentation of the original performers or recording conditions. Patches of soot on the vaulted ceiling trace the arcs of swinging censers, now hung silent. A fine dusting of soot outlines the perimeter of two large salt basins, where incense might have pooled during subterranean processions. Restoration archives from 1912 mention careful cleaning efforts that removed much soot, but photographs preserved in private collections reveal stark black rings still visible decades ago. Conservationists lament the loss of that visual layer, arguing that soot itself served as a palimpsest of ritual use. A slow, rhythmic drip echoes in response to a whispered prayer, each plip sounding like a distant footstep in an empty nave. Legends insist that miners who spoke their deepest fears aloud here heard comforting responses carried back by echo. Whether coincidence or consolation, the chamber's acoustics foster empathy and introspection, qualities as vital now as they were for miners fearing collapse in the dark. Footsteps approaching from the entrance stir the still air, and the hush breaks. Flickering lantern arms guide you back toward broader galleries where sunlight will never reach. The alcoves, in the dim, flickering glow of a single lantern, ingenuity takes shape as miners fashion crude yet effective tools from the very salt they carve. Basic iron picks and wooden mallets remain indispensable, but necessity spurs creativity far beyond these staples. Rope and pulley assemblies, known as windlasses, emerged by the 14th century, enabling a fourfold increase in hoisting capacity compared to manual lifting alone. Guild records from 1362 decree that each shift must maintain at least one windlass for every dozen men, underscoring how deeply embedded these devices were in daily operations. Yet debate lingers over whether these windlasses represented genuine medieval innovation or merely adaptations of ancient Roman designs rediscovered during intermittent scholarly revivals. Historians are still debating this question, weighing parallels between Wieliczka's implements and earlier Mediterranean examples. Complex bevel gears appear in the mine's faintly lit recesses, their worn teeth hinting at a primitive understanding of mechanical advantage. Local smiths forged iron cogs to mesh with wooden gears, an uncommon blend of materials chosen for durability and ease of replacement. One obscure manuscript found in an abandoned bucket lists 6 bronze bushings, used to reduce friction in these gearboxes, a detail that surprised modern metallurgists when microscopic analysis confirmed traces of tin and copper alloy. Such bushings suggest a level of metallurgical sophistication rarely associated with 15th-century rural workshops, challenging assumptions about the mine's technological reach. Ventilation posed another challenge. Stale air and toxic gases could turn routine work into a deadly trap. Medieval engineers installed ceramic anemometers, small bowls with precisely angled notches, along key shafts to measure airflow. By adjusting wooden shutters in adjacent tunnels, they controlled draft direction and volume. While mainstream technical treatises acknowledge the existence of these devices, only 3 examples survived into the 19th century, long after most collapsed shafts were sealed. Debate remains on whether the anemometers formed part of a standardized ventilation protocol or served as experimental prototypes tested by particularly forward-thinking masons. Innovations in water management also attest to miners' problem-solving prowess. Archimedean screws, likely introduced through Central European trade, appear in early 16th century sketches of brine drainage systems. These helical pumps, carved from oak and lined with copper sheathing to resist corrosion, lifted brine from lower galleries to settling basins above. An obscure entry in a Krakow patent registry credits a master Yanko with modifying the screw's pitch to improve efficiency, yet no physical specimens survive to confirm his design. Scholars debate whether such modifications represented genuine breakthroughs or incremental adjustments to pre-existing machinery. Tracks and trolleys reduced the backbreaking toil of hauling heavy salt blocks uphill. Timber rails carved from local spruce guided wooden carts, while carved grooves in salt floors prevented wheels from slipping on brine-slick surfaces. One unusual example discovered in a side tunnel features a dual-groove pattern, allowing carts to switch tracks seamlessly, a feature akin to modern railroad turnouts. This ingenious track work appears in a single 17th-century mining ordnance, but some argue it was a one-off experiment rather than widespread practice. Historians are still debating its prevalence and impact on overall mine productivity. Measuring devices enhanced precision in carving and expansion. Copper plumb bobs, hung from hemp cords, ensured vertical shafts maintained a straight line. Wooden rods inscribed with incremental markings served as early depth gauges, although at least 1 meter stick found in a sealed gallery bore salt-induced distortions, complicating modern attempts to interpret its original scale. A quirky detail emerges in a laborer's diary. The rod's creator reportedly coated it in boiled fish oil to repel brine, inadvertently creating a foul odor that earned the tool the nickname stink stick. This vivid anecdote underscores how practical needs and impromptu solutions intertwined. Lighting innovations extended the reach of torches. Reflective plates carved from polished salt, dubbed halite mirrors, lined corridor corners to throw light deeper into darkness. Miners fixed thin metal sheets behind lamplight burners, angled to cast beams around sharp bends. One preserved mirror, housed in Krakow's museum, still glints faintly under modern illumination. While some scholars view halite mirrors as utilitarian fixtures borrowed from distant glassmaking traditions, others argue their precise curvature suggests original mind-specific experimentation in optics. The question remains unsettled, fueling lively academic discourse. Communication across galleries posed critical safety concerns. Miners devised signaling systems combining rope tugs and bell chimes. A series of coded tugs on taut hemp lines would trigger small copper bells at check-in stations. Manuals from the late 1600s describe a 5-pull signal meaning, "all clear," and 3 pulls indicating danger below. A rare surviving bell, inscribed with a miner's initials and dated 1689, confirms this practice. Yet controversy swirls around whether such systems were widespread or limited to primary haulage routes, as some accounts imply informal hand signals sufficed when bell mechanisms failed. Safety devices included improvised brine flood barriers. Wooden sluice gates, framed with salt-encrusted beams, could be slammed shut to contain sudden water surges from unseen fissures. Archaeologists uncovered remnants of hydraulic locks near the hidden brine springs, but must rely on grainy 19th-century sketches to reconstruct their operation. Debate persists on whether miners intentionally designed multi-level dam systems or simply reacted to emergencies with ad hoc barricades. Modern hydrologists attempt computer models based on scant dimensions, yet disagreements over initial conditions keep reconstruction speculative. Surveying deep galleries required stable reference points. Bone-based inclinometers, simple L-shaped devices carved from cattle ribs, helped measure shaft angles. Miners balanced these contraptions against walls, marking reference grooves to maintain consistent slopes. This odd choice of material proved remarkably durable in high-humidity environments where wood warped but bone held form. Scholars remain divided on whether bone inclinometers were original inventions or adaptations of above-ground tools repurposed for the mine's peculiar microclimate. Multi-use instruments showcase creative economy. A single hammer with interchangeable heads, one flat for breaking, another pointed for carving, demonstrates modular design centuries before industrial machinery embraced interchangeable parts. One rare specimen, retrieved during 19th-century excavation, bears a small inscription: Salvus unum, duos manu, one tool, two hands. This motto hints at a codified approach to tool standardization among master miners, though some researchers argue that interchangeable head hammers were too complex for routine use and likely confined to elite workshops. Cartographic innovations complemented mechanical ones. Salt-etched maps, carved into portable panels, displayed tunnel networks and resource veins. One surviving panel, its carvings filled with black pigment from ancient charcoal, offers a remarkable planar view of 3 connected levels. While most such maps perished under shifting salt layers, historians debate whether these etchings represented true navigational charts or served as ceremonial tokens marking territorial claims within the guild structure. Quirky personal touches appear amid serious engineering. Some miners embedded small figurines, tiny salt-carved mice or horses, into tool handles as protective talismans. A 1712 guild injunction ordered their removal, citing superstitious distractions. Yet many persisted in secret, convinced that the charms warded off mishaps. Such practices underline the interplay of practical mechanics and human psychology, a blend of craftsmanship and belief that defined salt-forged ingenuity. In the depth's hush, every tool speaks of innovation born from constraint. Equipments that survive, rusted hammers, encrusted pulleys, warped gauges, bear witness to generations of miners who engineered solutions with scant resources. While mainstream histories credit royal patronage and guild sponsorship for technological advances, scholars of medieval labor emphasize grassroots invention among rank-and-file workers. Historians are still debating the balance between top-down directives and bottom-up creativity in shaping Wieliczka's mechanical legacy. Emerging from the workshop alcove, torchlight dims as the narrow corridors beckon. Ahead lies the venerable legends of royal tribute, tales of kings commissioning salt sculptures that merge art and complex mechanics. Yet beneath each monument stands a foundation of salt-forged ingenuity, a reminder that in these caverns, human creativity thrives in silence, shining as brightly as any polished crystal. Glistening columns and sculpted pedestals fill the royal tribute gallery, each one bearing the effigy of a monarch whose power was measured in brine and coin. Lantern light plays across the salt-carved visages of kings and queens, their crystalline portraits frozen in time yet aglow with centuries of reverence. The first tribute you encounter honors King Casimir III the Great, who in 1330 decreed a royal salt monopoly that transformed Wieliczka into Poland's white gold vault. Court annals recount his surprise inspections deep underground. One even credits him with hauling a cart of salt blocks farther than any miner, a feat recorded in municipal ledgers as both jest and testament to his hands-on rule. Mainstream historians agree his policies underpin the kingdom's economic stability, funding fortified cities and cultural projects for generations. Nestled below Casimir's relief, a single entry in an obscure 14th-century ledger describes a private gift, a leather pouch of gold coins left by the king for the master carver's family. That act stands out as a rare example of direct barter between sovereign and artisan, preserved only by a margin note. Debate flares over whether the gift ever reached its intended recipient or languished in royal vaults, as gaps in ambassadorial correspondence leave room for speculation. Historians are still debating this question, underscoring how even well-documented reigns conceal hidden layers. Turning your gaze to a neighboring niche reveals Queen Jadwiga of Poland, her salt likeness carved in 1397 to celebrate famine relief efforts. Monastic records confirm her role in negotiating grain exports that eased hunger, and chapel inscriptions imply she funded a relief showing herself distributing salted loaves. An Old Church Slavonic chronicle adds an odd detail. Miners presented the queen with a salted bread sculpture said to resist spoilage, an extraordinary anecdote largely ignored by economic surveys but alive in local folk festivals. Epigraphers dispute whether glaze remnants near the statue's base reflect her original seal or a later Baroque embellishment. Scholars remain divided on this point, weighing chemical analyses against stylistic clues. A few strides onward, the hall widens to showcase King Sigismund I the Old, whose 1522 commission yielded a finely chiseled bust rendered with lifelike drapery and a removable salt goblet once held in his carved hand. Found fragments of that goblet during 19th-century digs offered the first proof of interactive mine art, and chemical tests reveal Venetian glass dust mixed into polishing compounds, hinting at cross-continental influences. Whether the technique was introduced by Italian artisans or evolved locally from trade networks still fuels academic debate. The figure of Augustus II the Strong dominates the next alcove, his lion's mane and regalia carved in 1722 as a testament to Saxon-Polish alliances. He reputedly gifted a jeweled salt shovel to mine overseers and insisted on classical iconography, like the lionskin motif, despite local traditions favoring Gothic styles. Historians question whether such neoclassical elements represent genuine stylistic import or surface embellishments by later restorers, and dust-encrusted graffiti hints at secret justs held in his honor, described only in a solitary memoir by court painter Louis de Silvestre. Suspended overhead hang salt-crafted chandeliers, once studded with candles for Baroness Elizabeth von Dönhoff's 1778 commission. Polished to refract lantern light in a cascade of prisms, they were adorned with crushed alabaster and carried resinous citronella residues, an early scent and light design both practical and theatrical. Debate lingers on whether the citronella blend functioned as insect repellent or simply provided aromatic flair, a detail that continues to divide historians of medieval hygiene. Dwarfed by imperial tributes, Emperor Franz Joseph I's bust from 1884 marks the late phase of royal patronage. A miniature salt locomotive model once steamed in his base, though only photographs survive after World War I. Traces of recycled shell-casing metals detected in the sculpture's support structure have sparked controversy. Were these alloys tribute to fallen soldiers or mere wartime scavenging? Scholars are still debating this peculiar melding of imperial art and martial memory. Along quieter walls, small heraldic salt tablets bear coats of arms from noble families, carved with tools ranging from heavy picks to fine chisels. Chemical analyses uncovered ultramarine and cinnabar pigments, renewing arguments over whether polychromy adorned every tribute originally or was applied selectively during restoration phases. Epigraphic experts dissect seal imprints linked to the Archbishop of Gniezno, suggesting ecclesiastical oversight. Yet absence of matching diocesan records has left that claim unresolved. At the gallery's edge, barter tokens lie in shallow niches. Wooden crates of salted cod, kangaroo leather satchels from distant envoys, and bone-engraved discs marking tithes paid in kind. Such diverse tributes illustrate the mine's broad networks, from Baltic fishermen to Dutch East India intermediaries. Whether single shipments indicate fleeting exchanges or sustained trade remains contested among global trade historians. Stepping back, the mosaic of royal tributes glows softly in salt's light filters through the final shaft as the passage narrows and the air grows fresher, carrying a hint of pine and distant bird calls. As you step onto the last salt-laced rung, every creak of the wooden ladder resonates like a promise of dawn. Torches held below flicker against damp walls, their glow retreating as natural light advances. Soon, salt incrustations will pale under the sun's brilliance. Yet for now each crystalline facet seems to glimmer in anticipation. A collective breath held by generations of miners seems to exhale in this moment, bridging centuries of subterranean toil with the world above ground. At the top of the ladder, a low vault reveals itself before a heavy oak door bound with iron straps. Ancient hinges groan as they swing open, revealing a sliver of emerald forest beyond. Stepping across the threshold, salt dust tumbles from boots in delicate white clouds. The cool breeze carries whispers of leaves brushing and distant animal calls, sensations so vivid they feel dreamlike after the mine's constant hush. Historians agree that this exit shaft dates to the early 14th century, carved under Casimir III's reign to expedite salt transport and improve ventilation. Yet debate persists over whether its original purpose was solely practical or also held ritual significance, marking miners' rebirth into daylight. Chest tightening at the sudden brightness, you pause to shield your eyes and let the sun's warmth settle. Once acclimated, the landscape unfolds. Rolling hills dotted with oak and beech trees, a ribbon of road leading to the distant silhouette of Krakow's spires. Every inhale fills lungs with fresh oxygen rather than brine-scented air, and the contrast sharpens memories of damp corridors and echoing drips. A humble stone marker stands beside the exit, its inscription partly eroded. Ad lucem et vitam, to light and life. One obscure 17th-century monastic chronicle describes an earlier marker here, a wooden crucifix that disappeared during a flood, lending this spot a layered history of loss and renewal. Shaking salt from hair and tunic, you tread the narrow path leading away from the mine's mouth. Each step evokes miners long gone, once laden with buckets heavier than any pack you bear now. An unusual surface tradition held that departing workers cast a coin into a nearby well as thanks for safe passage. Local lore claims these coins remain at the bottom, gleaming faintly underwater. While archaeologists have siphoned silt from the well, no medieval coin hoard emerged, prompting scholars to question whether the practice was widespread or merely the fanciful retelling of a single miner's gesture. Historians are still debating this question, relying on fragmentary accounts and surface surveys for clues. Beyond the well, a broad kennel of wildflowers and low shrubs frames the path back to civilization. Petals of early spring blooms contrast vividly against the mine's monochrome depths. Their resilience mirrors that of halophilic lichens clinging to salt-dusted rocks inside, echoing the interplay of life and mineral everywhere. An entomological survey in 1892 documented rare ground beetles near the mine's entrance, species believed extinct elsewhere. These insects thrive in the saline microclimate drifting from the caverns, a surprising link between subterranean and surface ecosystems. Modern conservationists preserve their habitats, balancing tourism with ecological sensitivity. Approaching a small wooden bridge over a bubbling stream, reflections catch the facets of dissolved salt crystals suspended in clear water. That stream originates from runoff of hidden brine springs, once channeled into wooden troughs for transport, but now free to wander through forested gullies. Local mill records from the 18th century refer to unusually mineral-rich flours ground here, producing bread darker in hue and richer in taste than typical loaves. Culinary historians debate whether that bread's distinct character owes as much to soil composition as to brine's subtle infusion. The contested theories hinge on grain sourcing and millstone where patterns, with no consensus yet reached. The forest opens onto a grassy clearing where morning light warms chilled skin. A solitary bench overlooks the mine's earthen headframe and the patched roofs of miners' cottages. Sitting there, salt's cell from clothes slowly dissipates, and quiet reflection sets in. Memories of echoing tunnels, crystalline caverns, and hidden chapels converge into a tapestry of human endeavor. Records show that families of miners gathered here for annual festivals, sharing salt-rubbed meats and ale brewed with brine-infused water, an obscure tradition remembered in folk songs but omitted from official festival logs. Folklorists continue to debate whether these communal gatherings were encouraged by mine authorities or emerged spontaneously among workers. Fingers brush smooth planks carved with initials and dates, graffiti left by travelers over centuries. One set of letters marks ET 1837, likely an early tourist from Krakow seeking marvels beneath the earth. Guidebooks from that era extolled Wieliczka as the eighth wonder, boosting visits enough to inspire a dedicated service road. Yet some architectural historians challenge whether the road alignment reflected medieval haulage routes or was laid out by 19th-century engineers to accommodate horse-drawn carriages. The alignment's subtle curve hints at older paths, but definitive archaeological proof remains elusive. Heat of the sun intensifies as clouds drift overhead, shadows flickering across undulating ground. A gentle hum of distant machinery from a modern processing plant reminds that salt extraction continues, albeit by different means. Contrasting centuries of manual labor with today's mechanized drills underscores how the mine evolved yet stayed true to its core purpose, harvesting salt as both necessity and symbol. Industrial historians debate whether modern extraction methods respect the mine's heritage or erode its authenticity, a discussion shaping conservation policies and local economies alike. Children's laughter tumbles from nearby cottages as families head to Sunday market in the village below. Colorful stalls brim with crafts, miniature salt sculpture replicas, halite jewelry, and postcards depicting the cathedral caverns. The mine's legacy lives on through local artisans, their hand-carved amulets echoing medieval votive offerings left in hidden niches. One master carver insists his techniques derive directly from 15th-century guild traditions, though art scholars question how accurately those methods survived oral transmission. The debate over tradition versus innovation permeates every facet of the mine's cultural afterlife. A narrow dirt track diverges toward a stone church on a gentle rise, its spire visible from the mine's entrance. Parish registries record that miners and their kin attended services here after long shifts, their salt-stained garments visible among bright pews. Sermons preached on salt symbolism, preservation, purity, covenant, bound surface faith to subterranean work. Theological scholars remain divided on whether these sermons deliberately integrated mining metaphors or simply drew from universal biblical references to salt. Either way, the connection between Earth's crystals and spiritual truths resonates deeply in local memory. Strolling past headstones of long-departed miners, engraved with hammers and pickaxes, a sense of continuity settles. Each grave carries a story: births, deaths, marriages, life cycles marked by salt's shimmering presence. Genealogists piece together lineages traced to distant villages, where surnames like Solski and Salksak reveal ancestral ties to salt work. An obscure 17th-century census lists over 400 families living in cottages clustered around the mine, though demographic studies struggle to reconcile population shifts with plague outbreaks and economic upheavals. Historians debate how much external factors versus mining conditions drove migrations and social change. Eyes lift to the sky's vast canvas, clouds drawing silent patterns against endless blue. That same sky once seemed out of reach to first-generation miners descending tunnels unlit and unknown. Emerging now, the world holds new textures. Wind in tree branches, birds on moss-covered stones, sunlight carving patterns on lichen-tagged boulders. In this light, subsurface shadows feel like distant memories of another life, vivid yet separated by time and elevation. Footsteps lead toward the market square's center, where a bronze statue of Saint Kinga stands, ring held aloft in blessing. Fresh flowers at her feet echo subterranean offerings left in salt chapels, bridging devotion above and below. Plaques recount her legend in multiple languages, inviting pilgrims and tourists alike. While some scholars lament the statue's modern materials as lacking salt's tangible essence, local tradition embraces it as a living symbol of shared heritage. The ongoing debate speaks to evolving narratives of authenticity and memory. Passing through an arched gateway into the village proper, cobblestones echo familiar rhythms. Once pounded by wooden clogs, now by leather-soled boots. Shops offer halite lamps and salt-weathered icons, reminders that salt remains both commodity and muse. Despite commercial trappings, the sense of wonder sparked by the mine endures.